Hello, this is the Stories Beside channel. I release videos every day for you. Subscribe and click the bell. Nancy loved to walk in the woods. It was a place where it was especially easy and good to breathe. She had grown up in the nearby villages and knew the place like the back of her hand. Every path was familiar to her. And yet her boyfriend Ethan was always anxious and readily aware of her next hike. "How do you know who might be out there waiting for you in those woods?" he asked. "How many people can you run into?" "Like who?" Nancy asked, even though she knew the answer perfectly well. Ethan was beginning to boil over. Anybody, some alcoholic or drug addict, a hobo who had a cabin there. "But what tramps are there?" The girl laughed. The only tramp in the whole neighborhood was an alcoholic Ben from a pig farm. That's the kind of guy you'd meet anywhere. No bandits in our woods. "Can you believe me? Our village is too far from town for them to get here. So don't worry. I'll stay safe and sound." "I'd like to believe that," Ethan muttered. "Because you know who your corpse will be brought to if anything happens." Nancy rolled with laughter. "Ethan, I love your humor, even though it's too black." "Good if it is," Ethan muttered, "because I'm not laughing at all. And I wasn't thinking of joking. I was being completely serious. Would you stop with these walks already? It won't do you any good." But Nancy kept repeating over and over what he was saying and let it pass her lips. She attributed all Ethan's fears to the fact that he was not a country boy, settled in their village. A year ago, right out of medical school, he'd worked as a paramedic. He took over from the honored doctor of the local hospital, who had been in that position for almost 30 years and was still very serious. He saw danger and a catch in everything. The woods, in his opinion, were inhabited by dark characters. The farm was unhygienic and bacterial. Even the neighbor's dog he considered a breeding ground for fleas, and deep down, he didn't like it. It seemed very strange that such a sensitive person should become a doctor. Nancy put up with his oddities, but did her own thing. Deep in her heart, she hoped that in time Ethan would get used to country life and begin to walk with her. But the boy always found some excuse. "You know I hope to get higher education," he said. "And for that you need to study a lot. What a forest when you barely have time to read a book." That was the truth, even though they lived in the countryside, not the city. Ethan had plenty of patience. Pensioners with high blood pressure, children with broken knees, and even losers with poisoning. His office was besieged. Ethan spent his evenings pedantically reading, and Nancy, when she finished her work at the post office, would go to the garden or the woods. This evening she went to the edge of the woods, not knowing what she would find instead of berries. At first Nancy did indeed pick berries. Mechanically, she bent down to the ground, putting them in a bucket. Very soon, however, this activity tired of the girl. She went deeper into the woods, immersed in her thoughts, and not noticing anything around her. Nancy was not afraid to get lost and chaggle, not knowing where she was going. Her feet chose her own path. As always on such occasions, she pondered her and Ethan's future, and whether it could be one for two. Sometimes Nancy felt like she was in love with a guy, and other times she felt that Ethan was just a good friend, maybe even the best of all, but not the man she would dare to commit her life to. And how to make sense of those feelings. The girl didn't understand at all. Somewhere in the distance was heard the murmur of a car, and it brought Nancy back to reality. The girl froze and listened with surprise. The highway was a fair distance away. There was only a country road here, and no one but the ranger was using it. Who would want to drag out into the middle of nowhere at night? For a few moments, she headed toward the road. Nancy had no doubt that she would meet there only the forester Victor, whom she had known since she was a child. Still, she tiptoed toward the row. Her sixth sense told her to be careful. It was Ethan and his horror stories. Angry, the girl thought. But that's who an outsider would wander into our woods. It's such a wilderness out here. It was getting closer and closer, and Nancy froze. She didn't know much about cars, but it was a quiet car and nothing like the roar of Victor's iron horse. Nancy shuddered involuntarily. Maybe Ethan was right, and she shouldn't get involved in this story. But there was nothing left on the road, and the unsolved mystery beckoned like a magnet. I wouldn't sleep at night. I kept wondering what was going on. She told herself to take a peek. That's all. No one would notice anything. Nancy was indeed sure that the driver would not hear her. She had been walking in the woods since she was a little girl, and her late grandfather, a gamekeeper, had taught her to track animals long ago. To move quietly enough to see both the cautious roe deer and the majestic elk, and sometimes even a fearful hare. Not for the sake of hunting, but to admire the world of wildlife senseless. Nancy couldn't stand it. This world was too beautiful to deliberately harm it. Cautiously heading toward the road, the girl looked out from behind the trees. Through the bushes, she spotted the god of the car, and the last doubts vanished. The woodsman's car hadn't been painted in years since she'd bought it, and here was such a luxury. A man's voice was heard somewhere nearby, and Nancy almost gave 3 catches. The owner of the voice was out of sight. He was lurking on the other side of the car and appeared to be very, very anxious. "Christina, we didn't agree on that," he said. "I'm not saying I'm a saint for murder." He lowered his voice here. "I didn't sign up for murder." Nancy covered her mouth with her palm to keep from screaming murder. It seemed Ethan had been right to warn her against reckless trekking in the woods. This was not going to end well. It wasn't until a few seconds later that the girl realized it wasn't about her and that her life was out of danger. When the stranger on the road said the name Robert was still alive, but well understood, the conversation stopped. Apparently, not quite. The man on the trail, however, continued to be nervous. He cursed to himself, lit a cigarette, and began to pace the path. Nancy saw the glimpses of her behind the bushes, her white blonde hair, and could hardly contain them from sneezing. The girl couldn't stand tobacco smoke, and now that peculiarity could play her a disservice. Nancy had no doubt that the stranger would not be ceremonious with her. Forgetting his sanctity and everything else, he would kill her on the spot to leave no evidence. The woods were darkening rapidly. The man finished smoking and opened the door from the back seat and started pulling something out. From the sound of it, something heavy, because the stranger was puffing and muttering something under his breath. A heavy hog. Nancy heard him. "I don't want you, girl, to see anything for the enormity of the car." Meanwhile, the stranger was moving away from her, dragging his burden into the thicket on the other side of the road. Nancy, hearing the crunching of branches, was secretly glad that the man did not go in her direction. Hiding in those bushes would have been difficult. Even for her granddaughter, the gamekeeper, a collision would not have been avoided. The noise grew farther and quieter, and the girl began to fidget, pondering the best course of action. Maybe she should have run to the village and called the police. But she was miles away from the nearest residential home. That would take too long. And who would go with her? The only policeman, Michael, long relaxed in the countryside, grew a beer belly and was simply not trained to catch criminals. The most he could do was to bark at alcoholics on hog farms. Here we were talking about murder. The girl shifted from foot to foot, unable to stand still. Somewhere around here some man needed help, and she stood by and could do nothing. Unless the white-haired man was unfamiliar with his bucket. But that was ridiculous to think about. All that remained was to wait to see what would happen next. Soon footsteps were heard again. The stranger was coming back. He continued to grumble, but this time there was relief in the man's voice. He seemed to have accomplished his task and was unspeakably happy about it. The stranger took out his phone again and reported back to his friend. "Yes, Christina is all right, all right. I'm telling you, Robert, the courts. Don't worry about a thing. Get the champagne ready. I'll be at your place in a couple of hours." Nancy continued to stand still until the car disappeared into the distance. The picture she had witnessed made too strong an impression on the girl. She was still afraid to move, even when the grunting of the car finally subsided, humbled by the usual forest sounds. It wasn't until a few minutes later that Nancy came to her senses and forced herself to take a step out from behind the tree. It was urgent to act. Nancy stepped out onto the road and looked hesitantly in the direction the stranger was taking something away. The girl didn't have the guts to utter the word body. Judging by the words of the scoundrel from the expensive car, it was impossible to help the unfortunate man who had been carried away into the bushes. Still, Nancy couldn't help herself. Could it be that the killer had made a mistake? The girl thought, I must be sure of everything. Truth be told, Nancy couldn't imagine examining the corpse. The girl decided to think about it later, when she got to him. First, the body had to be found. Nancy crossed the road and moved deep into the bushes, finding her way through the broken branches. A couple of times, the girl took a wrong turn, and she had to go back to find the right path. The rascal had carried the body far enough, and Nancy was about to resign herself to the inevitable. Back to the village when she noticed something red behind a long log. The girl involuntarily gasped, thinking it was blood. But immediately she exhaled with relief. It was nothing more than the sleeve of a red jumper, and here was the owner of the sweater. It proved more difficult to look at. Nancy slowly walked around the log and looked frightened at the corpse. The man lying on the ground was wearing a jumper and jeans. On his feet were sneakers. It was all pretty good looking, but filthy beyond belief. The killer must have dragged the body on the ground. It was impossible to see the victim's face. A bag was put over his head. The body wasn't moving. Neither did Nancy. Her own idea of feeling the corpse for a pulse struck the girl as ridiculous, or rather scary. She would never dare do that for anything. We should get Ethan in here. And then suddenly the girl heard a strange sound, as if a wounded animal were moaning. But there were no animals nearby. Only this unfortunate man, the victim of a terrible atrocity, which meant that Nancy looked incredulously at the man. For a moment, the girl thought she saw his finger twitch. Then again. Immediately, not a second more, she ran up to him and pulled the bag off the man's head. The stranger was alive. There was no doubt about that. Only now did Nancy notice the rise and fall of his chest. The hapless murderer had never managed to follow through, had not dared to get his hands dirty with the crime, leaving it up to time. There was no doubt that without Nancy's help, the stranger would hardly have lasted long. Without access to oxygen, and with the beatings he had, he would hardly have lasted long. The man was indeed badly beaten. His face was covered with bruises. There was a terrible gash on his head too, and the girl had tears in her eyes at the sight of these bruises. She didn't even dare touch the stranger for fear of hurting him with an unguarded movement. Having not thought of anything better to do, Nancy called out to the man, "And can you hear me?" Of course he couldn't hear her. The man was in such a deep faint that Nancy's voice would hardly have reached him, even if the girl had dared to scream. In fact, it was the screaming she was afraid of, and to draw attention to herself at all. Nancy seemed to think that the killer, no matter how far away he was, he would hear her scream many kilometers away and return to finish his job. Only now he would kill 2 people himself. Doesn't trade in plastic bags to finish the job. Surely the girl looked at the man one more time and muttered quietly, "I will certainly be back with help. You just wait for us, please." Once upon a time in high school, Nancy participated in a steeplechase. The course they ran on seemed to the 9th graders a difficult one. It was full of bumps and potholes. Only now did the girl realize that the race had been the blossoms. The berries began now, as Nancy raced through the bushes, choosing the shortest route to the village. These were no longer bumps and potholes, but real ravines, logs, and bushes, clinging to her hair and clothes. At one point the girl fell, but immediately rose to her feet, ignoring the pain in her knee. What did it matter when there was a man dying in the woods? He was in more pain after all. Nancy ran up to Ethan's house in total darkness as the rare streetlights came on. The door was closed, and she banged on it like a mad Ethan. "Ethan, open up." Nancy, it took Ethan forever to get to the door. When did he finally open the door? His eyes widened with surprise. "Nancy, what's that look?" he exclaimed. "What's the matter?" "I went to the woods," the girl answered, barely catching her breath. "That I know," Ethan interrupted her. "I warned you not to do that. What happened to you? You're just now coming back in this dark." "Nancy, silly. Did you meet some jerk? Did someone hurt you? Tell me where it hurts." All these questions made Nancy's head spin, but the sincere concern evident in the boy's voice touched her to the core. "I really did meet a rascal in the woods," she said. "Even more of a murderer. My God, Ethan, I almost saw a man get killed." Ethan's face expressed shock. Nancy took him by the arm. "Calm down, Ethan. It's all right. Nothing bad happened to me. And the man was still alive when I left. That's why I came to you. You have to come with me and save him." "Why did I?" asked the boy, still reeling from the shock. Nancy looked at him in surprise. "Because you are the only medic in the whole village, not counting the vet. Who else is there to help the wounded man?" Ethan nodded reluctantly. "I suppose you're right. Wait, I'll check my kit and make sure it contains everything I need. In the meantime, why don't you tell me what the hell you saw in there? All I've seen so far is that someone almost killed someone, and you survived by a miracle. No details, and I need them to decide what exactly I should take." While Ethan went through his medicine cabinet with irritation, the girl told him the whole story, how she went to the noise of the car, how she watched a strange man and listened to his no less strange conversation. "You sure are crazy," Ethan muttered. "Nancy, do you have any idea what that guy could have done to you if you hadn't just noticed that guy? No one would have found you. Who would have thought to go into that kind of trouble?" Nancy didn't feel guilty at all, but she nodded obediently so as not to anger Ethan. He might even have some fractures." "Really?" Ethan muttered. "Maybe we should just stay out of it and call an ambulance. What if he's already dead? Let them testify." "Don't you dare say things like that to Ethan," Nancy exclaimed. "He's alive." "I'm sure he is. How would you know?" Ethan asked with a sigh as he closed the case. "Come on. Oh, by the way, we should get a flashlight. It's night." Ethan's old car pulled out of the garage. The guy was quiet. Nancy kept quiet for fear of annoying him with an unguarded word. "I told you not to look for adventures." Finally, he muttered. "But no, you weren't listening. If we'd been in the woods together, none of this would have happened. But you don't like going there, do you?" Nancy remarked. I call you. Are you more fond of your book?" Ethan looked at her darkly. "So you didn't have to go anywhere at all," he remarked. "You should have been out in the woods every night, as if there wasn't enough air. It's not like we live in a stone jungle or anything, you know, so we don't have to go out in the countryside." Nancy sighed sadly. A year of living in the countryside hadn't changed Ethan at all. He remained as alien to this land as he had been in the beginning. The girl remembered well the story of their acquaintance and did not know whether to laugh at it or cry. It was late last summer when Nancy came to the club with her girlfriend. Betty immediately disappeared into the crowd, off to find adventure. She was always the most boyko and in their pairing. And Nancy wandered around the room for a while, checking out people she knew and exchanging greetings with someone. That's when she spotted Ethan in the crowd. Apparently, the guy wasn't one of the hotties either, because he didn't even try to ask someone to dance, leaning against the wall and looking at people with the naturalist scientist look. It was as if he was studying beforehand which of us had what kind of diagnosis. Nancy laughed later, telling her friend about her first impression. Ethan had such a focused look on his face. You could tell he was a real doctor. At that time, the girl knew little about the visiting paramedic, mostly Babka's gossip. She heard that he was very young, slightly over 20, and that he had come to the village under some government program and dreamed of becoming a doctor in the future. The neighbors' cuckoos knew even that from somewhere. Deep down, Nancy felt sorry for the boy. She thought she probably missed the city and her relatives. She herself, at least, had really missed her grandmother during college. So the girl decided to cheer the guy up with a smile. "Good evening," she said a polite hello. The title of doctor put the guy on an unreachable height, and to address him with the usual "Privd" was simply not appropriate. Ethan gave her his doctor's appraising look and nodded dryly. She looked embarrassed and staggered away. Idiot. She scolded herself. Why did she pick on a stranger? She could see he did not need it. Now it was so embarrassing. Fortunately, it didn't take long for her girl to grate with these thoughts. First, Nancy chatted with the girls she knew, then exchanged a few words with Emily the barmaid. The girl had completely forgotten about her meeting with the young paramedic when someone called her hello. "Shall we dance?" Nancy looked around. She was approached by a 2 meters tall, huge, but with such a pure, naive look that only a child can have. "Hello, David." The girl nodded. "No, I'm sorry. I don't feel like it." As expected, the brat did not understand at first. "Why?" he asked. "Did someone invite you?" "No," David answered politely. "Nancy, I don't want to dance. I'm tired at work. Let's do it next time." The girl slowly backed away from the obsessive suitor, and her escape almost succeeded. But a third extra intervened. "She already said she won't dance with you." A man's voice. "Don't you get it? The new paramedic just recently got a close look at the people." He approached the pair of them. Nancy did not know what diagnosis he recognized on the face of her suitors, but she knew in advance how it would end and tried to reassure her protector. "Please don't worry," she said. "The paramedic is fine. David was just leaving." "Why am I leaving all of a sudden?" The little brat was indignant and didn't even think about it. He'd rather let that little idiot pry into his own business. The paramedic's temper didn't improve on that either. The lad flared up like a match. "What did you call me?" he asked me unhappily. "Didn't you hear me?" the big man asked cheerfully. "So you are deaf too?" "I may say it again. They're dead. How do you not mess with me?" "I got it. They're finishing up at the hospital. You want to go there too?" "And I'm my own hospital," the paramedic answered, and wasted no time in idle talk. The first one waved his fist. Nancy recoiled, frightened aside. The dancing couples broke up. Someone screamed. Ethan and David fought in the middle of the room, but no one even thought to separate them. Unlike the young paramedic, everyone had learned a long time ago that kiddies weren't to be trifled with. Nancy tugged on the sleeve of his classmate, Edward. "Stop them. What are you looking at?" The boy looked at her in surprise. "What am I to the extreme? They'll figure it out themselves. Now the doctor will collapse on the floor, and that will be the end of it." "You bet." And so it was. David wasn't a professional boxer, and he didn't play any sport at all. But he had height and strength on his side. Not a minute later, Ethan was stretched out on the floor, showing no signs of life. For a few moments, there was a deafening silence in the hall. Then someone shouted hysterically for a doctor. "He's lying on the floor right there," said a girl, and a lot of people rolled with laughter. Nancy was no fun at all, for she was the reason for the whole mess. The girl ran up to the paramedic and patted him gently on the cheek. "How are you agitated?" she asked. "There's nothing wrong with you." To her relief, the boy did open his eyes. "It's okay," he answered hoarsely. "I'll live." The couple left the hall to the excited whispers of the crowd. Ethan walked on his own feet, but the girls still supported him, fearing that the paramedic was about to fall. When they reached the street, Nancy asked, "Are you sure you'll make it home? After all, your house is far away, almost on the other side of the village. You are not dizzy, or maybe it hurts somewhere." The boy laughed, but immediately broke off laughing and writhing in pain. "I usually ask questions like that," he explained. "I never thought I'd be a patient myself one day." "You're not the first," Nancy assured him. "Everyone who messes with a stick ends up like that. The locals have known that for a long time and don't mess with him. And you're the new guy. You don't know our business yet." "Actually, I wanted to help you," the paramedic pointed out. "Shouldn't you have?" Nancy was embarrassed. "Thank you. I'm very pleased that you didn't stay away, but perhaps you really shouldn't have got involved. I've known David for a long time. We went to school together. Only he's a year older. He's a harmless guy. Never hurt a girl in school or now. Harmless, then muttered the boy. I noticed. Excuse me, please, said Nancy. It was all my fault. The paramedic let her words pass her lips and asked, How do you know where I live? Am I a local celebrity? Of course, Nancy replied with surprise. Didn't you know? Since your arrival in our area, the whole village has been talking about you. It's like having a guy at the table on a reality show. How can you live here? Tell me about it. I kept thinking it was the same old ladies coming to me 3 times a week, gossiping. Well, don't feel bad. That was Nancy's way of comforting him. Soon everyone will get used to you, and you'll be a village insider. The paramedic nodded playfully. Just 6 months to go, he muttered. What's the big deal? It's nothing. Neither Ethan nor Nancy could have imagined that, even after a year, the boy would still not belong in the village. The new paramedic was too different from the villagers to blend in with them, not that he would have been able to. The lad decided to change the conversation. By the way, why do you always address me as you? He asked. As far as I can tell, we are the same age. You are a doctor, she answered. I mean, excuse me, I can't address you as a classmate or someone I used to know. Besides, we don't even know each other. Ethan also introduced himself as a guy. But you probably already know my name. On your star. Nancy, she replied, barely hiding her smile. A pleasure. That evening, Nancy did not yet know where their acquaintance would lead. The felcher seemed to her a pleasant, slightly odd-looking fellow. It was only after a memorable night at the club that she hadn't met the guy for a long time, and had completely forgotten about him until one day her friend confessed. You know, I like Ethan. He's so cute. Nancy looked at her in surprise. What other Ethan is our paramedic? Rolling her eyes, said Betty. Have you forgotten about him? Everyone is just talking about it. Ethan did forget, answered Nancy. I'm so tired with all this work and gardening. I never thought I would say something like that, but I wish autumn would come sooner. The vegetable garden in front of her teased Betty. There's such a handsome man walking around, and you're stuck in your beds and can't see the light of day. No, Nancy, your grandmother is a real tyrant. Nancy wondered that day as the girl walked Ethan home. It didn't even occur to her to stare at the boy. Nancy was more worried about getting Ethan home than about his appearance. Love ravings, however, were of little concern to Nancy. She was preparing for the last school year in college and flipped through her notes to refresh her memory under the forgotten knowledge of how to make contact with him. Dreamily, said Betty, going to the disco and ask him to a white dance, suggested Nancy. You're brave. It's easy for you, isn't it? Betty thought about it and nodded. That's a good idea. That's what I'll do. You have to take the bull by the horns instead of waiting for someone else to do it. That goes for guys too, so don't miss your chance. Sitting behind the books. I don't like anybody, absent-mindedly said the girl, so there's no one to grab. And you, Betty, good luck. Tell me later how things worked out between you and Ethan. But there was nothing to tell Betty. At least that night, after his first rather unsuccessful outing to the club, Ethan had rarely been there and almost never danced. It was as if he appeared out of boredom. Betty failed to win over the paramedic, but Nancy herself unexpectedly got an appointment with him. It happened quite unexpectedly during another evening work on the garden. The girl fell and hurt her hand, not just hurt, and got a long bleeding cut. Wendy's grandmother grabbed her heart and told her to go immediately to the doctor. But Grandma objected to Nancy. Where am I going to go? It's already dark. The paramedic's office is long closed. Let's just fill the wound with it and wait until morning. It's just a simple cut. It's no big deal. No, there's Wendy. And it's not an ordinary cut. I think it needs stitches. That word really frightened the girl, and she protested even more. But where to? Under her grandmother's watchful eye, Nancy obediently made her way to the paramedic's office. As expected, it was closed. "So what next?" Nancy asked. "I told you this whole doctor thing was pointless. Let's go to his house," resolutely said Wendy home. The girl got excited. "Well, grandmother is too much. At home a man rests, tries to forget about work, and here we are with our problems." "Yeah, Ethan's probably gone to bed by now. Did he take the Hippocratic Oath?" Grandma objected. "So he's supposed to treat his patients anytime." "Don't even talk me out of it. We go to the paramedic's house." Nancy burned with embarrassment as she approached Ethan's house, accompanied by her grandmother. There were lights burning in his windows, already a relief. No need to wake the boy. Wendy knocked demandingly. Footsteps were heard at the door. "Who's there?" "Worry?" Ethan asked. "The patients," her grandmother said sternly. Her granddaughter hastened to add, "Ethan is Nancy from the club. Could you open the door for us, please?" The boy appeared on the doorstep. He wore a casual t-shirt and sweatpants. Behind him, the television was muttering. Ethan did not look the least bit like a doctor. No wonder Wendy frowned. "Good evening." The paramedic greeted them. "Have you had an accident?" "I fell in the vegetable garden and cut my hand," Nancy said, holding out her palm to him. "Look, please." Ethan lowered his gaze and frowned. Wendy inquired busily, "Needing stitches?" The boy nodded. At Nancy's feet with fear, even the pain receded into the background. "You can't do without it." In a faint voice, she asked. Ethan shook his head. The feldsher looked at the frightened face, the girl, and his look softened. "It won't hurt at all," he comforted Nancy. "I'll give you anesthesia." He let the women into the house. Wendy sat down in a corner of the room so as not to disturb the doctor's work, and Ethan brought a suitcase with everything he needed. "It won't take long?" Nancy asked anxiously. "It won't," Ethan promised. "And don't even think about crying. Look at that bunny. That beast has a lot of stitches, and he's smiling. Take an example from him." He handed the girl a stuffed bunny that was really covered in stitches and everywhere else. The toy's life didn't seem to be easy. "What's the matter with him?" Nancy asked. With pity, looking at the hair. "It's all my young patients," the paramedic replied. "I gave them this rabbit as an assistant for injections and other unpleasant procedures, and they clutched it too tightly. As a result, I had to treat both the children and the rabbit. It's my job to stitch everybody up." Poor Nancy muttered as she looked at the bunny on the head. "He's a hero. All right." "Is he?" Ethan confirmed. "And you will be a hero." "Good. Don't faint or tear the hair to shreds. Especially the first one. Your grandmother will never forgive me for that." The young men turned around and looked at Wendy. The woman had such a stern look on her face that it was clear the man who defeated her granddaughter was in for a very bad time. Ethan gave the injection, and Nancy grimaced, looking away. "It won't hurt anymore," the boy promised the doctor's words. And yet Nancy continued desperately, clutching the hair like a drowning man clinging to a life preserver. The paramedic tried to distract her with conversation. "By the way, I never found out what you do," he said. "Maybe you could tell me. You work, you study. You really want to know." She looked confused. "Or are you afraid I might faint? Is that why you want me to think about something else?" Ethan answered altogether. "And I am afraid, and it is stupid to sit in total silence. Besides, it's not fair. The whole village is watching me. They don't know what to say. And I haven't really met anyone. I live here now." Nancy shrugged. "There's not much to tell. I'm in teacher training college, and on summer vacation I pick up our mailman, Kelly. She's got a vegetable garden, and it's been a long time. Poor woman just can't cope with everything." "Are you going to be a teacher?" Ethan asked. She nodded. "Yes, elementary school. I've always loved children, but I didn't have a brother or sister. I, on the other hand, had a large family," Ethan answered. "That's why I ran away to the country. We were all getting crowded in the same apartment, and renting a place in the city was expensive. Nancy realized for the first time that she had never thought about it, even if the young paramedic had relatives or not. The girl herself had no one but Wendy. Her mother died when Nancy was 5 years old. She did not know her father at all. The girl had no idea what it meant to have a full family. Where would you want to go if you could? Suddenly, Ethan asked, if you could choose any place on the map. Nancy was at a loss. She was embarrassed to admit it, but she hadn't driven anywhere beyond the city. So the whole map was a mystery to me, Nancy said. I mean, I learned geography at school. I've seen pictures. I've seen movies. But it's all too fantastic for me. It's like if anyone is going anywhere, it's definitely not me. I would go to Africa, Ethan said with a smile. I've been dreaming about it since I was a kid. All kinds of jungles, national parks. I want to become a real specialist and go somewhere. I want to see the world at least. Nancy looked at him with admiration and involuntary respect. Such confidence in her abilities was not available to her. That is why the girl dreamed of something. In her opinion, the small position of a teacher of a strong family. Maybe about the sea, which the girl has seen only in pictures. That's all, Ethan said, for bandages her hand. Now come to me every morning for bandages. Nancy looked at the snow-white bandage with surprise. Time passes so quickly over conversation. The paramedic winked at her unobtrusively. That's why I always talk to my patients. It's like another dose of anesthesia. You know. Thank you, Nancy muttered. Until tomorrow. Then, she got up and headed for the door. But at the last moment, she remembered about the rabbit. She was still clutching in her hand and returned to Ethan. Thank you, repeated the girl. It really wasn't so scary with that helper. Ethan waved his hand to keep it. That hero should have retired a long time ago. You can see for yourself. Besides, he's a fighter too. Might come in handy. All the way home, Wendy wondered about her granddaughter. If her arm was hurting, if the paramedic had performed the operation carefully. In general, she asked a lot of questions that seemed unnecessary and unimportant to Nancy. Her head was occupied with something else entirely. Was Ethan talking to everyone the way he was talking to her? He himself had said he did, but he had given her the bunny alone. What kind of gift was it, anyway? Nancy was touched by it, but there was certainly nothing romantic about the gesture. Her friend thought that only a bouquet of roses or a golden ring could be considered romantic. What a hair for her, and yet she did not tell Betty about it. I don't know why. It all came out on its own. At a moment when Nancy was totally unprepared for it. Are you still getting bandages? Betty asked. One evening, about a week after Nancy got her stitches. The girl nodded. Yes, Ethan said he'd have to go to him for another week. He wants to watch the wound heal for another week, her friend muttered. You might think so. Then you would leave him alone. Nancy looked at her in surprise, thinking she must have misheard. What? She asked again. What do you mean? Betty, what did you hear? She answered. Also called a friend. Knew I liked him. I knew I liked him, and you still started making love to him. I thought I could trust you, but you. What affair? What do you think? I cut my arm so badly on purpose to get stitches, as if anyone in their right mind would do that. How could you even think that? Was I supposed to think that? Question for question, answered her friend. Do you see each other every day? He gives you presents. I think it's pretty clear. Tell me you're officially a couple, and I'll leave you alone. At least that would be fair. What kind of gifts? Nancy continued to be perplexed. What are you talking about, Ethan? You've never given me anything. Betty poked her finger at the bed. Her friends. What's that? You know, I was at Ethan's house the other day, trying to scratch out his sick days and get to know him too. I saw that bunny at his house. He's giving you toys already. A candy bouquet. It's called the period. Nancy didn't know whether to cry or laugh. She had completely forgotten about that bunny, and she hadn't even thought to hide it. Over the past week, she had become so used to the toy that she hardly paid any attention to it. Every night the hair was beside her like a pillow or a blanket. It's just an old, worn-out toy, Nancy told her friend. What kind of courtship? Are you crazy if it's just a toy? Let's throw it in the trash, Betty suggested. It's not a gift from your lover anyway. What do you need it for? Nancy hesitated. She looked at the sad bunny's face. Betty's suggestion seemed sacrilegious to her. I won't throw it away, Nancy replied to her friend. It would be disrespectful to Ethan. It doesn't seem right at all. You love him, Betty concluded. I thought you were my friend, and you are worse than an enemy traitor. She stood up and headed for the door. Nancy tried to stop her, but Betty yelled not to touch me. You're nobody to me now, and go kiss yourself with your paramedic. You don't get in his office every day for nothing. The fight with her friend hurt Nancy a lot. During her high school years, she had not been a very sociable, shy girl. You could say that Betty was the only friend she had. All the other classmates might not have offended Nancy, but they didn't make her stand out in any way. Breaking the long-standing friendship was very difficult. Nancy's bad mood wasn't getting any better, and after a couple of days, Ethan asked you what was wrong. You look like you've been drowning in water lately. Maybe your arm hurts. Nancy shook her head. No, it's all right. Well, not really. But my arm doesn't hurt. It's more like a sore soul. Would you care to share? Ethan asked. You are not a psychologist, the girl said hurriedly. That's probably why I'm not. Besides, I don't have much of a problem. I'm more of a self-involved person. It was all a lie from beginning to end. Nancy was very worried about breaking up with her friend and had no doubt that the pain of it would stay with her for the rest of her life. But to admit it to Ethan and to tell her why they had quarreled, no, that was impossible. So there would be no revelations. Nodded Ethan. Okay, but we're going to try psychotherapy. How about taking me to the movies tomorrow? They're promising a comedy. It'll make you forget all your problems in no time. A comedy? Nancy was surprised. Is there a movie at the club this weekend? I haven't heard anything about it at the club. The guy in town corrected her. I'm going to take some things to my folks in town. Mother loves country sour cream. It'll only take a quarter of an hour. I'm not going to stay with the family much longer. Then we can stop by the movies. What do you say? Nancy looked at him stunned. This offer was so unexpected. Perhaps remembering Betty's feelings, she should have refused. And yet the girl so wanted to answer yes. Over the past few days, Nancy had grown quite frantic without her companionship. Her friend was getting lonely, and the suggestion of going to the movies seemed harmless, almost friendly. It was as if he'd solved her doubts. The guy said, "Comedy, nothing more. Please don't make that face, Nancy. Going to the movies is not yet a proposal to go to the registry office." The girl blushed and nodded. Okay, let's go. Only we'll have to be back before dark. Otherwise, my grandmother would get worried. She's always afraid of all sorts of accidents. Just a movie, Ethan assured her. Then straight home. Ethan kept his word. They just went to the movie, and the boy did not give the slightest hint that he expected anything more. In the middle of the movie, Nancy became more relaxed and was able to follow the story. All the way home, they heatedly discussed the movie. And the girl suddenly realized that she was doing it with Ethan no more difficult than she had done previously with her friend. He and I are just friends, she told herself. A guy and a girl can be friends, right? Pretty much the same thing. Nancy told herself the next weekend too, when Ethan invited her to City Day. And then, when the girl got bolder, she invited him to the woods herself, wanting to show him the places she'd known since she was a little girl. The local nature did not inspire the boy too much. It was clear from the start. And when the young people noticed the tracks of a wild boar by the river, Ethan fell into a silent panic. "And you're walking here alone?" he asked the girl. "No gun, no chaperones, no protection of any kind." "And why would I need a gun?" Nancy was surprised. "It's not like I'm going to kill anyone. Tell me, what are you? Aren't you afraid of boars?" Ethan didn't fall behind. "Nancy is being flippant. Do you even know what kind of brains these beasts have? What can they do to a man? After this encounter, it will be too late to laugh, and no doctor will help you. In vain. Nancy explained to him that she had been walking in these parts for 20 years, and nothing bad had ever happened to her. Ethan took an ill-concealed dislike to the forest and constantly lectured the girl, trying to dissuade her from those walks. But it was all in vain. Just as the girl could not understand his fears, Ethan could not understand why Nancy loved the forest so much. He was right about one thing. Places like this did attract suspicious people, to say the least. For it was in the woods that Nancy witnessed a murder. A murder that almost didn't happen. I told you not to go there, Ethan repeated over and over again. As they drove into the woods, I told you. Weren't you listening? Go now. Slowly, Nancy asked him. I tied a ribbon to the tree where we should get out of the car. It's very dark now. I don't want to miss that spot. Ethan looked at the girl grimly, but did as she asked. Nancy looked intently into the trees. Should have brought a shotgun, Ethan muttered. Bob from the house across the street seemed to have one. Better yet, we should have called the police. I don't know why I didn't think of that. It must have been the shock of seeing what you looked like when you came in, and all my thoughts went out of my head. There's no need for a gun, Nancy said. I told you the murderer had gone away, didn't I? But he could have come back. Ethan objected. Have you thought about that? What are we going to do if we meet him, if we don't? Nancy answered. Everything will be all right. Ethan poked at her incredulously, but didn't argue with her, though it was obvious enough that he was sticking to his opinion. Stop, shouted Nancy. There's my ribbon white handkerchief tied and on the tree was clearly visible in the thicket surrounding it. Ethan looked at it grimly and got out of the car. Where to go? Briefly, he asked. Nancy led him into the thicket, praying to himself that they wouldn't get lost, and also that the stranger would be alive. Otherwise, what would it all be for? That her desperate race, the anguish of the unknown boy, and Ethan's grumbling were all for naught. It wasn't supposed to be like this here, Nancy said quietly, stepping out from behind the trees. There he is by the log. Look for yourself. In the darkness, it was impossible to tell if the stranger was alive or not. He did not move or make a sound. If Nancy didn't know for sure that there was a man in front of her, she might have thought it was another log. Ethan knelt beside him and took his pulse. Nancy waited with bated breath to see what the paramedic would say. Alive, Ethan pronounced. The girl let out a sigh of relief. It was too loud. Ethan flinched fearfully, shining the flashlight off himself. He began to examine the wound on the stranger's head, then felt for his ribs. There didn't seem to be any fractures, Ethan muttered. That's strange. Why is it strange? Nancy didn't understand. Because there probably wasn't a fight. I mean, almost didn't happen, corrected the paramedic. Probably just hit him in the face and then the head to render him unconscious. He didn't even have time to fight back. That's a good thing. At least I won't have to fix the fractures. What are we going to do? Nancy asked. Is there anything I can do to help you? You should, Ethan nodded. I don't think he'd be very happy if I threw him on his back and carried him to his car. You're going to help me. I'll take him by the shoulders, and you can handle his legs. Nancy nodded manfully. What else was she supposed to do? She couldn't just leave a stranger in the woods, especially since she herself was desperate to save him. The return trip took much longer. It seemed endless. Ethan walked with his back to the front and nearly fell a couple of times, tripping over some roots. The girl kept her eyes on the injured man's face and was very worried, fearing for his condition. Nancy feared that their help was doing more harm than good and mentally apologized to the stranger. She was comforted only by the fact that the car was getting closer with each step. I should have brought a stretcher, Ethan muttered. Better yet, I'll keep the rapist in mind for the future. The girl didn't say anything back. Her arms just snapped from the weight of her weight. There was no strength left to speak. The sight of Ethan's car behind the next tree seemed like a miracle to her. Put him in the back seat, Ethan said. Hold on, let me just get the door. They put the stranger down and watched him puff away for a few seconds. Nancy was ready to collapse from exhaustion. Who do you think he is? Asked the girl. Ethan shrugged his shoulders. How would I know? He muttered. Is he a gangster or some kind of big shot? You said he was brought in an expensive car. I think so, Nancy answered. I don't know much about cars, but it sure looked rich. A real tank. Definitely a bandit. Ethan repeated with conviction. Look at his goatee. A normal man wouldn't wear a beard like that. I don't think he's shaved in a long time, Nancy remarked. There's nothing criminal about it. Ethan bent incredulously. The girl realized that this stranger did not like the paramedic. The look. Ethan got behind the wheel. Nancy settled down beside him and anxiously looked at the wounded man. Please drive more carefully, she asked Ethan. What if he has any internal injuries? Which one of us is the doctor again? Or am I? The boy asked, squeezing the gas pedal to the floor. As they drove into the village, there was almost no light in the windows of the houses. Most of their fellow villagers had gone to bed. It was only at this point that Nancy. The most important question that came to mind was, where are we taking him? Asked the girl. To your house or to work? But who will look after him at night? Ethan thought about it. In any case, in the morning he'll have to go into town. I don't have a hospital here. I don't have any equipment, not even an X-ray. I can do injections, that's all. That's all. Then we'll go to your place. You examine this man and go to bed. I'll watch him at night. You have to work tomorrow, but you're so tired you can hardly stand on your feet. I can manage it all. Ethan looked at her incredulously. You'll stay the night at my place. What will Wendy say? Nothing, blushed, the girl replied. I'll call Grandma and tell her I'm helping you take care of the wounded man. She will understand everything. They carried the wounded man in and laid him on the sofa. Ethan muttered grudgingly, crying upholstery. A sheet should... And watch him, Nancy asked. I don't know if you need any help. I do need help, but don't expect much from me, Ethan replied. What am I capable of without equipment and normal medication? He brought his suitcase, laid out some tools, pliers. While doing all this, he kept muttering, it's all a murky story. Very murky. And I don't like the fact that we got involved in it. Can you imagine what would happen if they found out about us? Who? Nancy didn't understand. The guy who tried to kill our savior. Ethan said, what if he wants to find out if the man is dead or not? He'll go back to the forest. He won't find anyone there. And he'll keep looking. Here, of course, the first thing he will do is look in on the doctor. And who here will find his dead man? And the two of us. Who do you think will get the bag on his head this time? And what do you suggest? The girl sighed. To leave him as he is without help, I suggest we go to the police as soon as possible. Ethan answered with a frown. First thing in the morning. Better yet, let's go to the police right now. Let them find out what's going on. No need to go to the police, the injured man muttered. The young men stared at him in shock. Nancy asked uncertainly, I wasn't imagining it, was I? Did you hear it too? Yes, Ethan nodded. So he wasn't as faint as he seemed. We'll wait to see what else he says. They were silent, but the wounded man showed no more signs of life. Soon it seemed to Nancy that the man's voice was merely her own. He almost certainly had a brain injury, Ethan muttered as he examined the man, and who knows what degree of severity. We should take him to the hospital anyway and report what happened. But not to go to the police, Nancy remarked. That's not for you to decide, Ethan replied. And it's not up to him either. We could have a criminal case here, and I have to keep quiet about it. But he asked you to, the girl insisted. You heard yourself what Robert said. No need for the police. How do you know his name? Ethan was amazed. I heard what the killer said about him, Nancy answered over the phone. I told you. Ethan didn't ask any more questions, but he looked uncommonly unhappy. Nancy still didn't know what she had done to him. The girl had hardly slept that night, sitting at the table, and listening to the heavy breathing of the sick man. Ethan went to bed at her insistence, but also fiddled all night. Nancy could hear his heavy sighs and grunts. It proved to be a difficult night for all three of them. And in the morning, the stranger opened his eyes. "Hello," Ethan greeted him rather unkindly. "Robert, if I'm not mistaken." The guy looked at the paramedic and didn't seem to understand what was going on. It was understandable, after all the stranger had been through. He might well have forgotten what had happened to him yesterday. And here is a new attack. A complete stranger, a new place, some kind of interrogation. "How are you feeling?" Nancy asked, trying to keep her tone as friendly as possible. The stranger looked at her for a long time, and the girl began to fear that he would not answer. But the man did open his mouth. "I've been better," he muttered hoarsely. Ethan grinned. Nancy asked hastily if you were thirsty. "Could I get you some water? Would you like some sweet tea?" Ethan interjected. "Nancy, put the kettle on while we talk." However, the paramedic's intentions were not successful. The stranger was reluctant to speak. He seemed to find it difficult to do so. The only thing they managed to understand was that the guy flatly refused to go to the police or the hospital. Ethan was furious. "You brought a present from the woods," he grumbled, coming into the kitchen. "You don't say." "Oh, thank you." Nancy was confused. She had never seen Ethan in such a state before. And it struck the girl unpleasantly. "What are you going to do?" Shyly, she asked. "Exactly what I have to do," Ethan answered. "Call an ambulance. And in fact, it should have been done yesterday. And then you'll give a statement to the police. Or, if you want, say you just found it in the woods. No details. Let them sort it out themselves." "But you can't do that." Nancy gasped. "Robert told you not to do that." "I think you should listen to what he has to say, not just dismiss it. He's not a kitten or a puppy. He's a grown man. He knows what's best." Ethan looked at her almost disappointed. "I thought you were on my side." "Of course I'm on your side. But wait, have you ever had a fight with Robert so I don't have to take sides? Just do as he asks, that's all." Kindergarten muttered Ethan. "And if he dies, what are we going to do with a corpse in our arms? And if he survives?" Keeping up with Nancy, you can see that he talks to us and seems to be able to think. Would a human being, when he was dying, behave like that? "The human brain is a dark business," Ethan said. "Ah, what am I talking to you for? To you it's all movies, toys. How I do it is none of your business." They fell silent. Nancy was embarrassed by Ethan's rebuke and didn't know what to say. The guy muttered, "Okay, you got it. Who's going to sit with him?" "So you agree?" Nancy asked incredulously. "Where will I go?" Ethan muttered. He was surrounded on all sides. "Who will sit with him? You tell me. We both have to get to work. Does he need someone to watch him too? Why don't we call Wendy? She's probably bored with retirement anyway. Let her have her fun." Wendy questioned her grandmother doubtfully. "No, I'd better not. I don't want to bother her. I'll babysit him myself. I'll call Kelly and ask her to work at the post office for me today. After all, it's her position, and I'm so protective. They're even willing to sacrifice their salaries for it." Ethan sighed and looked at his watch. "I've got to get to work. There may well be patients near the office. I'll write you instructions, and then I'll be gone. I hope you still know how to give injections." Nancy had been a nurse for a while when her grandmother had problems with her blood pressure. However, she had never had to give an injection to anyone before. The girl didn't dare object to Ethan for one reason only. She knew he would call an ambulance for sure. And there was no way she could do that. Nancy did not know why. After saying goodbye to the paramedic, she returned to the living room. The wounded man was lying on the couch, his eyes closed. The girl sat beside him, not knowing what to do. "Where am I?" inquired the stranger without opening his eyes. "What is this place?" "The paramedic's house," Nancy answered. "You are in the village of Mikhailovka. It's quite far from the town of Mikhailovka." The boy repeated, "I've never heard of that place." He opened his eyes and looked at the girl. The stranger's gaze was haggard, but clear and full of consciousness. Nancy suddenly became bolder and said maybe we could introduce everything to each other. "I'm embarrassed to address you as you all the time." The boy hesitated a little, but answered Robert. "And I, Nancy." The girl answered, "Pleased to meet you." "Nice to meet you too." Reluctantly, he answered, "Nancy, how did I get here in the first place?" It was a very difficult question. The girl did not have enough knowledge of psychology to decide whether or not to tell him about the attempt on his life. "Don't you remember anything yourself?" Cautiously, she asked. The boy rubbed his forehead thoughtfully and dropped his hand on the bedspread. "Some fragments," he mumbled. "I think I was near the river, looking for a man, and then I can't remember." "And you weren't looking for a blonde man in a black foreign car?" Ethan left the girl in charge of the paramedic, not the investigator. That was the job that should have been done in the first place. "Ethan said you could have sweet tea, but not too much," Nancy said. "Would you like some?" The day went very strangely, at least unusually for Nancy. He and Robert hardly spoke anymore. He was in no condition to have long conversations. The girl gave him a shot, made more tea, and just sat there, listening to her new acquaintance's breathing and praying that he would be all right. After all, she was the one who had convinced Ethan not to call an ambulance. That way, if anything happened to Robert, it would be all her fault. After lunch, Wendy looked in, literally looked in. First, the old woman's voice came through the doorway. Then she herself appeared on the threshold. Nancy had the distinct impression that grandmother had not believed the story of the wounded man to the last. It was as if she were afraid of disturbing some romantic scene. "What have you got there?" she asked, entering the room and looking around. A tenacious glance, Wendy snatched everything, and at once wounded on the couch table, turned into a veritable medicine cabinet. Tired of her grandmother quietly asked Nancy, "You see, Robert is asleep now. He must not be worried." "Robert?" Wendy asked again, with curiosity, looking at the boy. Where had he come from? And what had happened? "I'll tell you everything later," answered Nancy. "For now, let's be quiet." "All right." Grandma obediently sat down next to her and began to look at the stranger. After a while, she said quietly, "He had a decent face. He didn't seem to be some kind of a rascal." "Thank you," muttered Robert, opening his eyes. "That's nice to hear." Wendy clutched her heart and laughed nervously. "Eavesdropping, by the way, is not good," she said. "How do you do? How did you manage to get yourself into such a jam?" "I haven't figured it out yet myself," the lad replied. "It seems I didn't have too good a time outdoors. There was an unfortunate encounter, and this is the result." "You have good meetings," Wendy remarked. "Aren't you a bandit by any chance?" Grandma said reproachfully to Nancy. She felt very uncomfortable in front of the sick man. First, Ethan mistook him for a criminal, now her own grandmother. Hospitality itself, however, the wounded man did not seem offended. Quite the contrary, a smile appeared on his lips. "You needn't worry. I didn't kill or rob anyone," he assured Wendy. On the contrary, suspecting that he was the victim of an insidious conspiracy. "I wish I could remember how it all happened. And in order to remember everything, you need more rest and gain strength." Nancy intervened. "Grandma, you can see that Robert is very tired. Let him rest. Don't tire him out by talking." "Good," the woman nodded. "I also see that your patient is not dressed as he should be. Look at all the clothes are dirty." "But we don't have anything to change," Nancy said, embarrassed. "I can't just go into Ethan's closets without asking, and he and Robert don't seem to be the same size." "I'll get my dead husband's clothes," said Wendy. "Robert, they should fit you. In the meantime, rest. I won't disturb you. Goodbye." She went away. "Boy," muttered your grandmother, "a holy woman. I've met very few people like that." "You can believe me. So you do remember your past?" asked a joyful Nancy. "The memory comes back to you. I have never forgotten my past," Robert answered. How could you forget it? I don't remember how I got here. What happened to me? Nancy wanted to ask questions, to ask if she should call his relatives and let them know where he was and what happened to him. But the look on Robert's face stopped her. It seemed that not everything in his biography was so smooth. Otherwise, the sick man himself would have asked for it. What kind of relative is it that Robert is more comfortable with her and her grandmother than he is with his family? They never spoke again. Nancy offered Robert something to eat, but he had no appetite. He slept most of the day. In the evening, Wendy showed up with the promised clothes, and then Ethan returned from work. Are you all right? He asked Nancy from the doorway. The girl nodded. Ethan went into the room and stared at the sick man. He greeted him politely. Hello, doctor. I don't think we met yesterday. Thank you for your help. Ethan nodded dryly and turned to the girl. How's it going with you? Was it short? He asked. Not very well, Nancy admitted. Robert hasn't eaten anything. And once he complained to me that he was nauseous. Dizziness. Do you have a problem with your hearing or your eyesight? Ethan asked the wounded man. He was still talking dryly and curtly, as if he were filling out a questionnaire. It was obvious that the paramedic just wanted to get rid of the problematic patient as soon as possible. I'll get some more pills tomorrow, he told Nancy. Honestly, though, this whole thing was beginning to annoy me. It would have been a lot easier to take him to the hospital and forget all about it. Ethan looked strung out and tired. The girl felt involuntarily sorry for him. Just a few days, she asked, and then Robert will go away, and we won't hear from him again. Be patient, please. Nancy folded her hands in a prayerful gesture. Ethan looked at her dejectedly and sighed. He's spending the night at my place again tonight, he inquired. Aren't you afraid rumors will spread through the village? Where would that come from? Nancy wondered. I am not a star to be watched. Who knows where I am? Who will even know where I live? No one in the village will know. Ethan, Nancy, sometimes I feel like I've been living here all my life. Not you. The locals are just looking for a way to scratch their tongues. I've seen that for myself. The paramedic's words came true a few days later, when there was a knock on his door. Nancy thought it was Wendy, and shouted nonchalantly, "Come in, Grandma." When Betty showed up on the doorstep, "Hi. It's cold," she said. "Well, a friend has settled in. Are you to be congratulated on your official marriage yet?" Nancy flinched and looked at Robert. He seemed to be asleep, not to take any chances. The girl ran up to her friend and pushed her out the door. Why should she? Stunned Betty. What do you want? Nancy asked dryly. Nothing, answered her friend. I just wanted to have a look. How do you and Ethan live here? To see if you'll invite me to the wedding, or have you completely cut old friends out of your life? I think my friends have cut me out, Nancy pointed out. Didn't they? You were the one who stopped talking to me and didn't want to hear any explanations. Talking to Betty after so many months of silence was very difficult. Nancy felt as if she didn't know the person standing in front of her. You stole my boyfriend, and it was my fault. Betty was indignant. Then she added, in another more peaceful tone, that you wouldn't even invite me to tea. Let's sit down and have an old-fashioned conversation. Nancy answered another time. I don't have time right now. That last phrase sounded like something she shouldn't have said. Her ex-girlfriend was beginning to suspect something. What's going on over there? She asked. Are you and Ethan hiding something? Maybe they took a kid out of the orphanage and didn't tell anyone, or just setting up the family nest. Let me see. Despite Nancy's protests, she burst into the room and froze on the threshold. She stared at the sleeping Robert for a few moments, then asked Nancy who it was. A friend of Ethan's automatically lied to Nancy, and immediately added a friend. Betty squinted incredulously at the friend. In this form, you're something dark. Tell me what's what, or shall I go to the police? Maybe you and Ethan almost killed someone, and now you're trying to cure him. What kind of nonsense is that? Nancy was indignant. How could you think that of me? After your betrayal, I could think anything. Betty cut her off, telling it like it was. Nancy realized she had nowhere to go. She took the girl outside and told her everything. You saw the killer just like that. Couldn't believe Betty with her own eyes. Yes, Nancy confirmed, and she wasn't afraid to look for the corpse. Betty asked, "You've got to be kidding me. And I thought you couldn't do something like that. All you know how to do is sit over a book and take other people's boyfriends out." "I didn't steal anyone," Nancy sighed. "It just happened." "Nothing happens by itself," mumbled Betty. "All right, I'm gonna go. Stay here in the hospital." She was leaving when Nancy hastily called out to her, "Betty, you won't tell anyone what you saw here, will you? Don't tell, please. It's a secret, giving it away. You would do Ethan a great deal of harm." "We'll see," Betty replied, and left. Nancy's spirits were troubled. She returned to the house and noticed that Robert was awake. She tried to play it cool so as not to frighten him unnecessarily. "How are you?" she asked. "Are you thirsty or have something to eat? It's not medication time yet." "Thank you." Suddenly the boy said. "Why?" Nancy didn't understand. "I thought you just found me in the woods. And you turned out to be my savior. That's worth a lot. I owe you for the rest of my life." Nancy blushed. "So you heard everything," she muttered. "I'm sorry. I didn't want you to find out that way. I thought it was about time," the boy objected. "I feel better already. I'm starting to remember things. And what you said just added to the whole picture. But that's not the point now." Robert tried to get up from the sofa, and Nancy rushed to escort you to the bathroom, she asked excitedly. "Or to the kitchen. Tell me, what do you want?" Robert only laughed in response to her words. "Actually, it is much simpler than that," he answered and took the girl's hand and brought it to his lips. Nancy thought her face was about to burst into flames. She wrenched her hand away and pushed the guy back onto the couch. "What else did you come up with?" she said embarrassedly. "Like in some chivalrous novels. Is it the least I can do to thank you?" Robert answered, "It's not every day that people save each other's lives, is it? You must agree that if it were any other woman, she would have passed right by you. Few would have rushed into the bushes, hoping to revive a corpse. There was almost no chance anyway. It's the most common thing to do." Nancy replied firmly. "That's what any man would have done in my place." But Robert disagreed with her. He wouldn't tell her his story, but life had taught him that even the closest person would push you to the brink rather than help you. And the best teacher of all was his wife, Christina. Robert didn't know what attracted him to her. It was like some kind of spell. And it started out quite mundane. Christina showed up at his office for a job interview. She greeted him as she entered the office. "My name is Christina. I called you about the job as a pharmacist, remember?" Robert nodded absently. Yes, I remember. Come in, please have a seat." He owned a chain of pharmacies, and by the standards of his town, he was quite a wealthy man. He ran his own business without any powerful relatives, all thanks to his diligence and luck. Robert had been active since his youth. At his father's insistence, he went to medical school, although he had no desire to become a doctor. However, it helped him in the future. During his studies, the young man made many useful connections and acquaintances, which helped him in building his business. He would not have been a good doctor. Robert himself understood this. He could not even get used to the sight of blood. He could not look at it without an inner shudder. Never mind treating others. But he had a businessman's streak. Many things Robert came up with purely intuitive insights. He was also very optimistic. This is why he did not take into account the timid objections of his friend Daniel, to whom he proposed to go into active business. "It's worthwhile," Robert said, "and we can pull it off. We'll take out a loan, and my acquaintances will lend me the room on the cheap. I've already made arrangements with them. There's something coming up with medical supplies too." "Go for it." "I don't know," Daniel mumbled. "It's a long shot. I wouldn't want to go broke and be left in the lurch." "You'd think you'd make a lot of money in your office," Robert remarked. "We've got such a chance to take off." In the end, though reluctantly, Daniel agreed. Robert himself didn't know why he had chosen him. Perhaps it was his long-standing friendship. For some reason, he had believed that he could trust someone he had known for years. How was he mistaken? At first, things were not going well with his friends. Despite outside support, starting a business from scratch was not an easy venture. Daniel kept complaining and said goodbye to his money. Robert, however, was not discouraged. He trusted his luck for a reason. Gradually, things began to get better. The friends opened another drugstore in another neighborhood, then another and another. Daniel stopped complaining about life and often acted as if everything they accomplished was entirely his fault. Robert chuckled quietly, but didn't reprimand his friend. It was understandable that the latter was eager to let his relatives and acquaintances see him off. Daniel was a smart guy, but a pessimist and a whiner. He had never attracted attention before, and now he couldn't help but seize the moment. Robert, on the other hand, didn't take it all seriously. The unexpected attention from women didn't crack his head open either. Many of his acquaintances, with whom the man had only greeted before, suddenly began to make eyes at him and make very transparent hints that they would not mind moving their relationship to another plane. Robert found it all funny and disgusting. "It's amazing how many people have shown their true colors," he said to Daniel once. "Are you talking about girls again?" my friend asked. "Not just them," Robert sighed. "Though it's unpleasant too. Remember Kate? She was my classmate. You might have met her at parties. She was that tall, blonde girl." Daniel wondered. "The legs from the ears, of course. I remember. How could you forget something like that? I mean, she was the hottest girl in your group." "So, Kate also wrote to you?" Robert answered worse. "She was hanging around my house to meet me, as if by chance. Say, how is it possible, if she has been living on the other side of the city for a long time?" "I wouldn't have missed her," Daniel muttered dreamily. "What difference does it make, by chance or not? The main thing is that such a woman comes into her own hands." And then there was some uncle from the village. Robert continued without listening to him. "I asked my father. This man is indeed my kinsman, but so distant. I didn't know he existed at all. And now this man comes and asks for money for his daughter's treatment. Allegedly, his family is in a difficult situation, and they can't cope without my help. I only gave a little just to get away. Because, judging by his face and the smell of booze, this uncle is a regular alcoholic. Unlike Daniel, who got rich with money, tasted all kinds of entertainment. Robert was head over heels in his work. He had no time to attend to his personal life. It was his last hope that fate would find him at work. And so it was. When Christina came in for her interview, she looked very stylish, but not vulgar. Minimal makeup and a strict suit. In fact, with her looks, Christina could have dressed herself in a sack of wine. All the attention would have been directed to her, except Robert didn't appreciate it right away. He was having trouble with some bills. Another shipment of medicine was running late, and one of the pharmacies was short of a pharmacist. Christina was a candidate for the position. He was specifically interested in her as a specialist, and her appearance at that moment was secondary. The girl could have been a stuffed vegetable grower or a man. Robert was primarily interested in the resume. "I see that you have work experience," he muttered, leafing through papers. "Can you tell me why you decided to leave your previous place?" "I moved to another area. It's too far from where I used to work," she said eagerly. "Besides, that pharmacy was more about different vitamins. I would like to move on to something more serious, to bring real help to people." She said this in a serious tone of voice. However, the girl's eyes were deceiving. If Robert hadn't been so bloated with problems, he would have suspected something. He would have realized he was just another fortune hunter. He would have known from somewhere that the drugstore owner was still single. Unfortunately, he wasn't up to solving puzzles. "Pleased with your mood?" Robert smiled. "Well, your resume satisfies me. I think we can employ you." "You won't be disappointed," with a smile promised Christina. And it was true. The girl quickly got used to the new place. There were no complaints about her. Robert didn't often make his own rounds of pharmacies. The next time they met was a month later. It was then that he noticed for the first time that the girl was very pretty, and he wondered to himself where his eyes had been during the interview. "Good day, Robert," Christina greeted him. "The weather today is wonderful." "It is." When you put it that way, Robert was embarrassed. "I feel like a slave owner. If it weren't for my pharmacy, you could be sunbathing on the beach or, I don't know, resting somewhere in the country instead of standing at the counter. How unfair is that, isn't it? I'm not reproaching you at all, and I don't regret anything. Somebody has to help people, right?" She objected and turned to the old lady who had come into the hall. "Hello, can I help you?" she said to the visitor, still serene, smiling. Anyone who, like Robert, would have seen Christina for the first time might have thought the girl just perfectly beautiful, kind, with a slight smile on her face. Her mood always seemed to be unclouded. Who in their right mind would refuse such a coworker or wife? No man in the whole world could have imagined that it was all just a mask. Christina had made it her goal to marry well, and she was willing to do anything for it. And it didn't matter that in the evenings she scrutinized herself in the mirror, anxiously waiting for the first wrinkles to appear. Gritting her teeth, knowing that time slipped aimlessly through her fingers, jealous of her boss's possible competitors. By day, she was still the same smiling girl who couldn't help but be liked, charmed everyone and everything. Finding the key to Robert's heart. There wasn't much information about him. Yes, and what could know, for example, cleaner's Aunt Valia washing the floor in the pharmacy. Christina learned from someone that Robert was allergic to poplar fluff. Allegedly, he had complained about it when he came to the drugstore in June. Christina's partner told her that the boss treats his employees very well, gives all kinds of presents for the new year or a birthday. He also treats his customers well, always conducts some kind of action. All of these were insignificant little things that did not bring Christina any closer to her goal. Unknowingly, Daniel stepped in to help. One day, he stopped by a drugstore. "Good afternoon," the girls greeted the pharmacists. The man winked at Christina. "And you? I see you all. Sit with your tongues. Scratch at least a production gymnastics done. Otherwise, you will lose your accurate figures before time." Christina's more modest partner was confused by this remark, and the girl grinned. "Take an example from you, Daniel Nikolaevich. You always travel by car. And Robert too. Could you switch to bicycles? Take care of your health." Daniel was of little interest to Christina except as a backup. Her seventh sense told her that it was Robert who mattered most, and she wasn't accustomed to playing second fiddle, so she kept Daniel on a short leash. Not that it opened her up, but she didn't give her hopes for anything either, although Daniel liked her. Christina could feel it in the looks he threw at her. "No, bicycles aren't my thing," Daniel sighed. "Don't take this the wrong way, but all that dust is dirt, too unaesthetic for me. Besides, I prefer less traumatic, dangerous sports, some kind of treadmill, for example. The bike is for Robert. He's out in the woods every weekend. Doesn't worry about his health at all." In the woods, Christina wondered. That's where they opened the new ski base. I've never seen him there. I have no idea where Daniel responded. "And you, Christina, are into cycling. I never would have guessed that." "I am," the girl nodded. "I'm Daniel, a very mysterious person. You would never think of it. What could I be fascinated by? Can you give me a hint?" Daniel asked with a smile. Fortunately, another customer came into the pharmacy and spared Christina from dealing with this nitwit. Frankly speaking, the girl had a low opinion of men in general. In her opinion, they were only good enough to get money out of them, or provide useful information, which Daniel did. Now Christina knew her boss's weakness and was ready to throw herself into battle. In her high school days, she had ridden a bicycle. A couple of hours of practice made her a master rider again. The following Sunday, the girl went into the woods to hunt. Only her weapon was not a gun at all, but her bicycle. Christina began her quest at the ski lodge, the same famous place that in the summer months was very popular in their town. When she saw where she had gone, the girl's spirits dropped a little. There really were a lot of people here, too many to find just one person in the crowd. Cyclists were whizzing by quickly. Some athletes were running past her, and Christina stood still and clenched her fists in despair. She already felt that the whole thing was going down the drain. Robert wasn't here, and even if he was, it was impossible to see him. It was easier to find a needle in a haystack than to look for her own boss in the woods. This must have been the first time Robert had been unlucky, because Christina had found him. The culprit was the kindness of man who came to the aid of a complete stranger. What do we have here? You broke your knee, but don't cry. You're a man. Christina flinched and turned around. Hearing a familiar voice, she didn't immediately understand what was going on. Then she caught sight of some toddler dying with tears in his cheeks. Beside him, a worried mother, and Robert fussed. But where else would this Robin Hood be, if not at the scene of the accident? She knew at once the part she was to play, carrying Mary Poppins, who is crazy about children, tried on a new image. The girl dove into the crowd. And who do we have here crying? At the expense of talent, approaching the baby, such a big boy frightened by some scratch. I'll put a magic bandage on it, and it'll go away in a jiffy. Christina purposely pretended not to notice the boss. If Robert realized she was watching him, her plan would fail. She bent over the child and waited patiently for the warden's retort. That was not slow to come. Christina asked in surprise, "And here you are." The girl turned to him and exclaimed happily, "Robert, oh, how small the world is, and I see you're helping people again." Robert remarked, "It seems that I really did not make a mistake when I hired you. You're so eager to help, weekdays and weekends alike." Christina smiled and took a band-aid out of her backpack, taped it to the boy's knee, and winked at him. "That's it. It hurts less now, doesn't it? It'll go away soon. Don't doubt it." The baby's mother sprinkled herself in front of them in gratitude, and Christina mentally praised her foresight. It was not for nothing that she had grabbed the band-aid. Not for nothing. Though she had taken it for herself, worrying about rubbing her heels with her new sneakers. The woman and the baby left, and Christina and Robert looked at each other. "Thank you very much," the man said. "I didn't have a first aid kit myself. Words alone didn't work on this boy. I'm afraid my desire to use a plantain might not have been appreciated by his mother. I also have medicine for blood pressure and headaches," the girl boasted. "Once on a walk, I met an old man who felt ill. I was very worried while calling him an ambulance. Since then, I decided not to take any chances and carry something. You never know when you might need medicine, right?" Of course, it was all a complete bluff. Christina was well aware that Robert would not reach into her bag to check her words. However, she made a note in her mind. We must replenish our first aid kit. The girl was always attentive to detail. And therein lay the success of her scams. "And what are you doing here?" Christina asked. "Are you also into cycling?" Robert looked a little confused. "Not really a fanatic, but I go cycling at weekends. It helps me to clear my head. You know, of course, I got on a bike myself." That's why she nodded. "Maybe go for a ride together, if it's not a violation of the chain of command on my part. You are, after all, my boss." "Stop saying that." Robert grimaced. "The boss is the boss. In the woods, all are equal. Of course we'll go. I'd be delighted to ride in your company." Christina came. She was ecstatic at the phrase, thinking that she had already won the boss over. But then she realized that from Robert's side, it was just a common courtesy. Likewise, he would have agreed to walk with the cleaning lady and Aunt Adriana, just because he was afraid of offending her. Christina's victory was still a long, long way off. The girl needed a new plan. Talking while driving was uncomfortable, so Christina sank into thought. Soon a thought occurred to her that it was boring to just drive. "Don't you think so?" she asked Robert. "Do you like extreme sports?" The man was surprised. "Maybe you like to drive on the mountains or travel around the world." "No, that's too much for me." She shook her head. "But I would like to speed up a bit. Would you like to race?" Robert suggested. "Though I must warn you, it won't be easy. I'm not a professional, of course. I'm an amateur, but I have experience. It won't be a fair contest, and you're not celebrating your victory before your time." Christina laughed. "I'm not as easy as I look either. You never know who will come to the finish line first." Of course, these words were another lie, but Christina did not worry about it. It wasn't the girl's intention at all, defeating Robert. She had an entirely different plan. She let her boss go ahead and began pedaling as hard as she could. She was waiting for the right moment to stage a little accident. The girl had studied Robert well enough to understand that he would not forgive himself such an accident, especially if his companion was hurt, and there, as they say, one step from pity to love. The only thing Christina had not considered was that the accident could really happen. The girl believed in herself so much that such a thought did not even occur to her. She did not notice a root on the road. She did not save her speed in time and flew to the ground. For a moment, all that remained in her mind was pain. Christina wasn't immediately aware of what had happened nearby. Someone was shouting her name. "Are you all right?" Agitatedly, Robert asked. Christina runs up to her. "You're bleeding." The girl looked frightened at her hands. The skin on her right palm was peeling. "My wrist hurt a lot. My knees were also hurting." But Christina didn't have time to figure out the damage. Tears came to the girl's eyes. "It hurts," she complained. This time, absolutely sincerely so bad. Christina had never felt so bad. "Did you break anything?" Robert asked, grabbing her by their injured arm. "Can you stand up? You need to go to the hospital as soon as possible." "My arm hurts, but it seems to bend," Christina answered. "And her legs?" She looked at her sweatpants, which she had been looking at online for days. She saw huge, ugly holes in her knees, and tears streamed down her cheeks with renewed vigor. Robert understood it in his own way. "Wait, a man asked me here. The ski lodge isn't far away. I'll race the bikes there and come right back for you. Then we'll go to the trauma surgeon. Don't worry." Christina almost didn't listen to him, preoccupied with her own worries. It wasn't until Robert was out of sight that she realized it wasn't all bad. She had got what she wanted. The boss remained very disturbed, and her trauma was evident. She didn't even have to pretend, for the sake of a successful marriage. The girl was even willing to settle for a fracture that didn't seem to be there. Christina gently bounced her hand and calmed down. At worst, it was a sprain. The girl smiled in relief, but immediately wiped the smile off her face. Robert was approaching her. "Christina, how are you with anxiety?" he asked. "Are you all right?" "I would not say so," answered the girl. "My leg hurts a lot. I may be able to walk, but very slowly." Christina waited with interest to see what the man would do. Robert fully lived up to her expectations, and like a true knight, "I offered to carry you to the car in my arms." She did not object. She resisted a little, but only for the sake of appearances. In fact, Christina wished all her friends could see her at this moment. "Robert carried me in his arms," she thought excitedly. The scene is just like in the movies. She was even more delighted when she found herself in Robert's car leather seats, air conditioning, and such luxury was almost in her pocket. "Excuse me," Robert muttered, getting behind the wheel. "If it hadn't been for me, none of this would have happened." "What's that got to do with you?" The girl sighed. "I overestimated my own abilities, and I offered you this unfair competition," Robert remarked. "Competing with the girl. Don't misunderstand me. I don't think of you as a dog at all. It's just that you're so gentle and airy." "Christina, you're more suited to dancing than bicycling." "So it is agreed." The girl nodded as a sign of conciliation. "You will have to ask me to dance after my recovery." "Of course I will. I have to beat you at something." It was then, looking at Robert's embarrassed and guilty face, that Christina realized that the wedding was almost in her pocket. It wouldn't be hard to wrap her head around it. And once such a simpleton managed to build a business, probably for the affairs of money and amorphous were responsible for completely different hemispheres of the brain. And by all appearances, the man's second one was quite bad, just as Christina had expected. No fractures were found in her brain. A slight sprain, that's all. And some minor scratches, which, if anything, hurt the girl's appearance. Robert drove her home and helped her up to the 4th floor. Christina smiled at the man. "Thank you so much for this day, in spite of how it ended. I really enjoyed our walk." "Still, forgive me," Robert repeated. "I will regret my arrogance for the rest of my life. I will remember that day with gratitude," Christina answered. "Where else could I have got to know you better?" The girl spent the next few days at home. Robert called her, wondering about her health. One day, he even took her to a restaurant. "You can't dance yet, so at least watch how others dance," he suggested. His innate caution failed him for the first time in his life. Robert forgot about the car. Everything was swirling around him like pesky bees, and about how Daniel had called Christina a sly little thing, and even that he himself did not trust women at all, considering most of them very treacherous. The girl had played her part too well and seemed like an angel to him. Robert realized too late how wrong he had been. The young people got married. A few months after the incident in the woods, they spent their honeymoon in Europe. Afterwards, they settled in Robert's apartment. The girl tried in vain to play her old role. Pretending to be another person 24/7 was impossible. Slowly, her true nature began to seep out. "Maybe next month you could take a vacation," she asked. "Maybe 1 year after we're married. We'll go to Brazil. You know, I find that destination very interesting. I've dreamed of seeing the statue of Christ since I was a little girl. And all those soap operas my mother watched when I was a kid left their mark. I want to feel nostalgic and see the places where soap operas were filmed. What do you think? Let's go." Robert was going through some papers again that night, and he didn't listen much to what his wife had to say. His head was once more occupied with work matters. "To India," he muttered. "Yes, Christina, that is original." "I was talking about Brazil," said the girl angrily. "Didn't you hear me? Or have I already become a painting?" "Since you're not even paying attention to me about Brazil," confused Robert interrogated. Robert asked me, confused. "So what's going on with Brazil?" "That's just it. Nothing." Christina screamed in fury. "I just want to go there." She snatched the papers out of her husband's hands and stepped aside. Robert looked at her in surprise. "If that is what you want, we will go there," he said. "We can go to Brazil, we can go to India, we can go to each country in turn. But not now, but next year. Is Christmas okay with you?" "Why not now?" Christina asked belligerently. Robert threw his hands together. "I don't have any money right now. And if I do not take care of the papers you just took, they will not be back for a long, long time. Return the documents. Please, no money." The girl asked again. "What do you mean? You were telling me last week about some kind of profit. A rise in business. I thought we'd finally be able to relax. I've already used all that money to develop the network." Robert replied in a conciliatory tone. "We're opening a new branch. Remember? I already told you about it." "The new branch?" Christina asked in a lowered voice again. "And you mean we don't have any money to travel at all? Even my friend Evelyn goes abroad twice a year, even though her husband works as an engineer. And as she herself said, their family is constantly living in loans." Robert remarked. "I'm sorry, but I don't think that's right. In my opinion, one should live within one's means and not be constantly in debt to someone else. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have to work. If I'm not done with this case, things will be very bad before morning." Christina looked at him angrily and threw the papers on the table. "Great," she simply muttered. "Wonderful. Then I won't interfere with your work. I'll go for a walk. Alone, of course. That's what you never have time for either." Robert said something to her, but she didn't listen to him, grabbed her purse and rushed recklessly to the door. Christina turned off the phone almost as soon as she ran outside. She knew perfectly well that her husband would call. The conscientious Robert, even if he was sure he was right, would still want to apologize to her, would find faults in his behavior. For example, he will feel guilty for not listening carefully to his wife, or even suspect himself to be rude. Robert was so naive. Normally, Christina was fine with that. She took advantage of her spouse's simplicity. But this time, she was just furious. She didn't want any of his apologies. Neither did Brazil, which she would never see again. She just wanted to be away from her husband. Christina was tired of playing her part. The girl did not know where to go, so she went downtown. She used to walk past boutiques and restaurants, looking enviously at the windows and people sitting at the tables. Now Christina was rich, and she could do anything for herself. Suddenly, she wanted to drink. She remembered a restaurant where she and her husband used to go out with friends. I went there to drink a little wine, or even something stronger, without pretending to be anything or pretending to be a guy. What could have been better in her situation? Christina entered the half-empty hall and chose a table by the window. She was now on the other side of the glass, but looking at the people strolling outside did not make her feel happy at all. That's all, Robert. Angrily, the girl thought. It's all his fault. Earning all that money and still saving money. Not about that. I dreamed that some loser, engineer's wife, had a better life than me. What's money for then? She had a glass of wine and then ordered a whiskey in the heat of the moment. She checked her phone. 5 missed calls, and grinned maliciously. Worried further, she mentally turned to her husband. Well, you count your numbers in such a mood you can't say anything. Christina felt someone's eyes on her and turned her head. Some man sitting at the other end of the hall was looking at her. The girl cringed, disgruntled, unhappy. She didn't need any suitors with their flat compliments. Christina was in no mood to make new acquaintances. Suddenly, she recognized the man and smiled. He was someone she knew. More than that, a friend of the family. The man seated at the table was Daniel. Christina waved at him cheerfully. The man took this as a call to action and moved to her table. Good evening, he greeted her. Are you alone tonight without your husband? Yes, Christina nodded. He is buried in his paper and does not raise his head to dig it out from under these numbers is fantastic. Daniel shook his head in annoyance. I recognize Robert. He's checking the budget again. I've looked at it 3 times. There's nothing wrong with it. But Robert, of course, knows better. He can find mistakes even where there are none. I think he's got talent. And in my opinion, it's just nerdy, muttered. Christina, we don't see life because of all the numbers. Especially me. Robert, maybe he doesn't care. He's a dry, insensitive man. And I'm rather sad that my life passes like this in one place. That's how my youth will end. While others fly to different cities and countries, drinking wine somewhere in Spain. I sit here in a provincial cafe overlooking a boring street. What kind of boredom is that? Daniel nodded deeply. Yes, making money for the sake of mere numbers on the account is rather reckless. As they say, no one knows when death will come for him. You have to make the most of life, as long as you can. That's my philosophy. It is a very correct philosophy. Christina agreed. I wish my husband could share it. Daniel nodded again and asked if we could drink to that. Christina had a glass of wine in her hand and looked at him thoughtfully. Why hadn't she noticed him before? It was nothing special. But on the other hand, how many men are around who don't look after themselves at all, walking around in stretchy tights and a stretchy sweater, smelling of booze? The girl wasn't particularly fond of blondes, but she was willing to turn a blind eye even to that. If you compare Daniel to many men, he was very nice. And in terms of moral qualities, he was even superior to Robert, the dry man. Did you come here alone? Christina asked. Did something happen to you and Jenna while Christina was married? The family friend had already changed several girls. As Daniel told me, his girlfriends were always the problem. All of them sooner or later wanted to get into a serious relationship and start teaching him about life. And the man didn't like it. And now he was turning to his usual complaints. "Jenna and I broke up about a week ago," Daniel confirmed. "I guess I should say we didn't get along." The story was just like yours and Robert's. Jenna was too right too, I would say, but there was always something about her that wasn't right. I came home late from work, or she was supposedly wearing someone else's perfume. A real paranoia. Towards the end, she thought I had something with her friend. This was out of the question. Not only did Jenna's suspicions come from nothing, I had never laid a finger on a girl, so she found someone else to be jealous of. You should have seen Jenna's friend. She's a real gray mouse. Being jealous of a girl like that, that's a real insult. Christina laughed heartily at the story. Daniel's distraught look amused her. "I wish Robert was jealous of me," she admitted. "At least a little bit. I think he's been getting a little too complacent lately. He probably thinks the bonds of marriage are the chains that have chained me to him. Unsure if he were even a little afraid of losing me. Things might be different. Only how to instill that fear in him." Daniel, smiling, looked at her. "To instill fear, you have to create a threat," he said. "And if you want, I can help you with that." Christina looked at him and suddenly cried. She was terribly hurt by her husband. There was no one near her, and only this man showed concern for her. They were both drunk and alone. Christina felt she had nothing to lose. She did not return home until morning, when Robert was ready to climb the wall. "Where have you been?" He snapped at his wife. "I must have called you 100 times or more. Are you telling me you didn't hear the call and never looked at the screen between looking and wanting to call back?" "There's a huge difference," Christina replied. "Did it ever occur to you that I just don't want to communicate with you?" The girl pushed him away and went into the room. Robert followed her. "The trouble with you is that you don't want to sit down and talk normally," he said bitterly. "You make a scandal out of any problem. Yesterday I wanted to talk, but you were busy with your figures." Christina cut them off. "You're more interested in calculations than you are in talking to me. Well, I won't stop you from counting for your own pleasure." From that moment on, the couple's relationship fell apart. It was enough for one rejection from Robert, one request from his wife, that all Christina's feelings for him, which she invented for herself, disappeared. The girl was annoyed with her husband for how pedantic he was about his work. His soft voice always spoke to her in an even tone of voice, the politeness with which he treated his own employees and waiters in the cafe. Daniel, on the other hand, was very different. He did not engage in special panic with the staff. He thought about business affairs only during working hours and spent his weekends, as he should, having fun, attending various parties or traveling. Having money and air travel allowed him to leave his hometown and travel far enough to be back at his desk on Monday. A couple of times Christina went with him. She made up the most ridiculous excuses, like going on vacation with her girlfriends and leaving home. Sometimes she and Daniel would simply go to a vacation house away from the city and spend the weekend in front of nature, with the usual candlelight dinner and champagne. Sometimes she felt like she was living in two families, or rather Christina began to think that her real family was Daniel. Robert, on the other hand, was something of an accountant, a man who provided her with money in some ways convenient, in others not. Surprisingly, he did not seem to be aware of his wife's infidelity, at least not to Christina. So it seemed, a normal husband would certainly give his wife an interrogation, she thought contemptuously. And this one? And what was it that I liked about him when I met him? Was it just money? More and more often the girl thought that she had made a mistake. She should have paid attention to Daniel from the start, the more carefree, open-minded man who suited her in spirit and money. That said, he had just as much. How well things would have worked out. One day, Christina shared these thoughts with her lover, but all she heard in response was a sad laugh. "Darling, do not imagine too much about me," he asked. "It would give me some kind of complex. Robert and I are not at all equal in our business." "You don't get it, Christina. Robert has invested a lot more in these pharmacies than I have, Daniel explained. And he had some money saved up, something he inherited from his grandfather. Some connections, and I had some pennies. I was always in Robert's pocket. Basically, he's the boss and I'm his deputy. You wouldn't live so sweetly with me, darling. Christina thought for a moment and pushed her foot angrily. But that's not fair, she declared. You started out together, built everything from the ground up. And my husband's taking it all for himself. I don't think that's fair. And we have to fight it somehow. Fight what? Honey, Daniel sighed. I was a young knave fool at the beginning of our case. In a word, I asked Robert to make it look that way. He was always pretending to be noble. He wanted us to be co-founders. And I foolishly followed his example. I went along with the whole thing, you know. I said I wasn't worthy and all that nonsense. I even insisted on it. In the end, Robert agreed with me, and now we have what we have. It's all very unfair, repeated the girl with a childish pout on her lips. If I were opening cases with you, I'd divide everything between us equally. But you're not the boss, and you don't own the pharmacy, Daniel said, kissing her on the lips. So let's stop all this sad talk and talk about something more interesting, like where you'd like to go next weekend. But no matter how hard Daniel tried to distract Christina, the thoughts of injustice could not escape her mind. She kept thinking over and over again how she could make everything better. She tried to find a way out of the situation and could not, except for one thing. But thinking about it was too frightening. Christina thought of this way. For a whole month I thought this way and that before I decided to open up to my lover. I should get those drugstores. She said she should be the boss instead of Robert. I wonder how Daniel wondered. You go to your husband and ask him to give you a seat. You don't have to shake your head, Christina. There are other ways. For example, inquired Daniel, for example, by getting his case as an inheritance, the girl answered. How about that? Daniel jabbed dismissively, as if she had said something amusing. It sounds too fantastic, he replied. Robert is as healthy as an ox. First, he wouldn't climb off his bike. Now he's disappearing into the gym, probably trying to console himself somehow. You're so seldom around. And this sucker hasn't figured it out. Christina grinned contemptuously. How can you respect a man like that? Actually, I guessed without any of his usual amusement, Daniel remarked. You know, he told me about his suspicions. Robert thinks you're seeing someone. You know, your tales of the many girlfriends you've suddenly become so popular with are a bit thinly veiled. Why didn't Robert just call me in to talk? If he suspected something to worry about. Christina asked. Why didn't he make a fuss and ask me directly? Don't you know him? Daniel muttered. Robert is just afraid of offending you. Can you imagine how ugly it would be if you were faithful to your husband and clean in front of the world, and he accused you of something? Robert even hesitates to hire a private detective, because that too is an insult. He'll watch until the very last moment, and in the end he'll figure it out. You'll see. Or did we screw up something ourselves? Then I'm sure we'll both be in trouble. By the way, did you know that Robert used to box when he was young? I don't know, but he would never lay a hand on me. I'm sure, Christina said, he wouldn't dare hit a woman. And me? Daniel asked. I'm not a woman, by the way, and I don't want to walk around with a broken nose. And I don't want to leave my cushy little place. Here's the thing, my dear. I think it's time we broke up. Christina, alarmed, looked at Daniel, thinking he was joking. Then, convinced otherwise, she shook her head fearfully. No, she muttered, you can't leave me like this. We were so much fun together, you and me. I'm sorry, Christina, but I still remember what it was like to count pennies until payday, Daniel answered. And I don't want to refresh that knowledge. You, of course, are dear to me. But without all that luxury, we won't survive. Think about it. What was it like for you when you were just a pharmacist? There has to be a way out. Christina muttered. Inheritance, inheritance. If Robert is in good health, We have to get rid of him ourselves. We must kill him. This conversation took place in a vacation home in a private room. Still, Daniel looked around frightened. "What are you talking about?" he exclaimed. "Why?" Christina said as if nothing had happened. "Don't tell me you're not tired of being second best. As an errand boy, Robert is the cause of all our troubles, you know that." Christina really thought so. In 1 year of married life, she had become so accustomed to wealth that she considered it all her own. Robert was an annoying hindrance to a life of fun. So Christina decided to get rid of him. It took a long time to convince Daniel. It was then that the girl was first disappointed in him. It turned out that he had neither courage nor fighting spirit. Daniel didn't have the guts, as they called it, to do something like that. Christina, too, was afraid of the possible consequences, but the sight of a man who was even more afraid than she was gave the girl courage. No one would find out anything, she assured Daniel. "We'll make it up in such a way that we both have flawless alibis. And then sometime after we get married, we'll own the drugstores equally. What do you say?" What could Daniel say to that? Of course, he dreamed of more freedom too, even if he couldn't admit it to himself. Still, as they say, water cuts stones. Eventually, after much persuasion, he agreed. I guess Robert really was just a point, because Christina's unexpected offer to take a vacation at some tourist resort away from the city did not arouse any suspicion. Surprise, right? Because such a simple vacation the girl never liked. But of course, he could not even imagine. What was the catch? Campgrounds. He asked again. Are you sure? But there's no restaurant, and there must be lots of mosquitoes. You told me yourself that you saw a lot of this in summer camp when you were a schoolgirl. And here's an offer like that. But you're just like a wild vacation, Christina objected. Poe, I myself admired. How good were you and the guys on vacation in your college days? This concession will be my gift to you. Things have been a little off between us lately. That's right, Robert agreed. Still, it's so unexpected. Maybe we could go wherever you want, but not to Brazil. Christina laughed. We'll leave that for Christmas and go to the country. Resolved. That same day, she began packing her suitcase. Robert could only marvel at the commotion, and in his heart he didn't feel particularly happy about what was happening. Of course, Christina was suddenly like she had been before. At the time of their acquaintance, the soft, smiling feminine. And yet this behavior seemed nervous, artificial. Robert was afraid to admit it to himself, but he began to get the feeling that his wife was gradually going mad. The menage a trois scandals of all the past months was suddenly gone. However, he could no longer believe Christina. Something was amiss in all this. But what he couldn't understand was that it was Robert who suddenly remembered a conversation with a friend that had taken place many weeks ago. At that time, he had first expressed the timid idea that his wife was cheating on him. Daniel only laughed in response. Who is cheating? Christina. He asked again. She is an angel. You are working too hard. If you can think of such nonsense, you should rest. Buddy, you'll go crazy with your work. Do you think I'm exaggerating? Robert asked doubtfully. But Christina has changed so much. She's with her friends all weekend, and she won't even talk to me. A woman's quirk, Daniel brushed her off. Some kind of hormonal imbalance. You should know that it happens. You're a doctor. Even though Robert did not argue with his friend, he could not believe him. He sensed there was something wrong with his wife, and the unkind look his wife sometimes threw at him was proof of that. This trip to the campground was strange from the very beginning. Christina still behaved nervously, laughed a lot, and talked nonsense. Do you think that next time we should go to these places and relax with a tent? She asked her husband. Well, her that abroad. Let's remember the childhood years of mosquitoes. Mud will be more interesting and more economical. And you're closer to work if there is any force majeure. If that was a joke, it was a very bad one, Robert muttered. Christina, I beg of you, let's talk normally. However, his wife constantly eluded serious conversation. First, when they were at the beach, swam away from her husband as far as possible, just not to answer his questions. Then she made the acquaintance of some single mother staying next door to them. Robert had never noticed his wife's interest in children before, but now Christina suddenly began to coddle the child and even started some kind of game with him. Call her to talk until late in the evening, when the spouses were alone in their house. "Christina, tell me what is going on. First, you decided to come here with me, but it turned out that you didn't really need me." There were tears in the girl's eyes. "Just like you haven't needed me all this time," she exclaimed. "You must pay your debts. Remember the last time you paid attention to me. All the time in your contracts, bills, and payments. Where am I and with whom? It didn't matter to you one bit, didn't it?" Robert objected. "You just never wanted to talk about it. You talked about these mythical girlfriends, but you never even told me their names. What was I supposed to do? Interrogate them, or at least wiping away her tears?" Christina answered. "If you cared about me, you would do anything to get to the truth." Robert hesitated for a long time to ask the next question, which was an unexpectedly frightening answer. "Do you have someone in your life?" he asked. "What does it matter?" Christina asked tiredly. She got up and went to the door. "Don't follow me," she warned her husband. "I want to take a walk on the beach." Alone nailed him with that word. The girl left the house. Robert stood like a dumbfounded man for a while, and then he went in search of his wife. He just couldn't believe things as they were. That evening, everything had to be decided, and it was a cool summer, so there weren't many campers. Robert walked along the floor of the hallowed alleys, which were sorely lacking in lanterns, and looked around. Then he went down to the water. Christina called softly to him. The beach appeared empty. Feeling like a fool, Robert walked along the beach. He couldn't help thinking that his wife had tricked him into going to the beach while she was visiting her new girlfriend and her son, drinking tea and laughing at the bum and her husband. So did she have a lover or not? Christina never gave an answer to that question. The shore was rocky, and the water was murmuring, hitting rubble. Robert heard someone's footsteps. He did not have time to turn around when he received a hard blow to the back of his head and fell face first onto the rocks. He did not understand anything else. Robert's awakening took place in a rustic. The rustic cottage was whispered over in a gruff way by a disgruntled boy and a young girl. At first, he noted only that the stranger had a clean, almost angelic appearance, a face without a gram of makeup, huge blue eyes. Only a few days later, Robert discovered that Nancy was indeed an angel, the very person who had saved his life. The girl was very embarrassed when Robert kissed her hand, blazed up like a poppy seed, and immediately she began to argue with him, saying that what she had done was perfectly ordinary, and that anyone in her place would have done the same. Robert disagreed with Nancy. 1 year with Christina was enough for him to understand that not every girl would risk her life to rush to the aid of another, especially when her reward was not a big bank account. Trying to hide her embarrassment, Nancy shifted the conversation. "You said you were beginning to remember something," she remarked. "Maybe you can remember the phone number of one of your relatives, or give us their address, so we can let them know where you are. You didn't happen to have a phone on you." "So I didn't know how to notify their phone. I remember, but I won't contact her," Robert answered grimly. "She'll come back, and she'll kill me." Now he was certain that the person who had attacked him was Christina, and no matter what had caused her madness, love for money, or a desire to hide his lover, whoever he was, a random person just couldn't get on base. No robber would have thought of such an elaborate plan to track their victim 100 kilometers out of town, go on a killing spree for a measly cell phone, and then drive the corpse into the wilderness. One thing Robert didn't understand was how Christina had the strength to do all this. He was a rather large man, and his wife didn't even go to the gym. She had a typical model's figure, hands like matches. The girl couldn't drag him anywhere in her life, unless she had someone helping her, the same lover whose name she was hiding. Apparently, Robert had sat like that for too long, lost in thought, staring off into nowhere, because Nancy was beginning to worry. "Are you sure you're all right?" she asked. "Wouldn't you rather lay it on me?" "I've had enough of lying down," objected Robert. "It's time to do something." Nancy stared at him and bit her lip. She was haunted by a phrase he had uttered the other day. "You said she would come and kill you." Reluctantly, the girl said, "Who were you talking about?" "Your wife." Gloomily, Robert answered. "Ex-wife, actually, because we should have divorced long ago. I think it's high time we got divorced. I can't give her a second chance." The wife's word hurt Nancy for some reason. The girl herself did not know what had upset her so. After all, she had seen the engagement ring on his finger before. And yet it was one thing to speculate, and another to be sure. As if he had read her mind, Robert looked at his hand, removed the ring, and threw it out the open window into the raspberry bushes. Nancy thought that the next time he worked in the garden, Ethan would have a good harvest. Perhaps he would be very surprised by the golden find in his raspberries. Nancy wanted to clarify who Robert thought that blonde guy might be, but she didn't have time to do so. Wendy showed up with her homemade broth, and the conversation had to be postponed. She was gone when Ethan showed up on the doorstep, even more gloomy than he had been lately, and madder than ever. "We've had a visit. It was time to do the honors," he said. "Come on, get ready. I'll take you to the hospital." Nancy looked at him frightened. "Ethan, what are you doing? You said it yourself. Robert has to stay in bed for a few days. That's where he'll lie down. I assure you, the beds in the hospital are as good as my couch, maybe even luxurious. It's getting crowded in here, the three of us." The girl glanced from Robert to Ethan and back to Ethan before she led the latter out the door. "Ethan, what's going on?" In a whisper, she asked, "What kind of fly bit you?" "Morning." "It was fine." "It wasn't," the paramedic answered stubbornly. "Nothing is normal. Only you stubbornly do not want to notice it." "And about the fly came to me. Betty told me what you were doing here." Betty. After all, she didn't keep her mouth shut like Nancy asked her to. Then again, what else would you expect from a hurt woman who's also your ex-girlfriend? "And why is that?" Surprised Nancy. "Enlighten me, because I don't know what the hell we've been up to." "What are you doing back home?" "I'm not myself." "He kissed your hands," Ethan answered in a tragic tone. Betty saw it for herself. "What do you call that?" "You tell me." "It's called human gratitude," Nancy answered. "Robert finally found out that I was the one who saved him, tracked down the criminal, and so on. He admired what I had done. Too much, I'd say. So he expressed his gratitude to the best of his ability." Ethan nodded. "If that's how this guy expresses his gratitude, when he can barely stand on his feet, what happens when he gets strong enough to kiss you? Right here on my couch." Nancy listened to the whole thing. "I can't believe my ears. What are you talking about?" "Ethan, that's so unlike you. I'd never have thought you'd stoop to such baseness. Slandering a sick man and our guest." "I'm sorry," Ethan muttered. "I just see the way he looks at you. First he takes my couch, now he wants to take my place in your life. You think I can just watch him take you away from me? It's all a load of crap," she muttered, though her heart was racing. Ethan said that Robert looked at her in a special way. What if he was right? Nancy herself didn't know how to feel about this message. He couldn't even know whether it pleased or upset her. "I'm taking him to the hospital," Ethan repeated. "It will be better for all of us. Don't forget that there might be some criminals following in this guy's footsteps. Who knows if they went back to that place in the woods and didn't find anyone there? I think they might have questions about where the body went. Or rather, they might suspect that the dead man had come back to life and walked out of there on his own. Let's ask Robert himself," reluctantly answered Nancy. "Whatever he decides, that's what will happen." "Sorry, I had completely forgotten that I am no longer the master of my house, but my own patience with bitterness," replied the paramedic. They returned to the house and were surprised to see that Robert was already on his feet. May and grasped the table. "I am ready, doctor." "Bravo," he reported. "We can go now, if you please." Nancy rushed to him and said excitedly, "What on earth are you talking about? You are still not well. And why go out at night? At least wait till morning." Robert took her aside and sadly answered it would be better if I stayed with you for a while. Ethan went to his car without saying a word. And Robert whispered to the girl, "In this house has very poor soundproofing. So I heard your conversation with this guy just fine. There really is no need for a third person. I have to go now." He gently released his sleeve, which the girl had grabbed, and went out into the courtyard. Nancy rushed after. "Be sure to let us know when she recovers, whether or not," she shouted. "What am I saying? Call us as soon as you can. We'll look forward to hearing from you." Ethan, who was already sitting behind the wheel, did not comment on her phrase in any way. Who is who? He was certainly not anxious to hear from his rival. Robert nodded and waved to her. The car was already out of sight when the girl realized she hadn't left him her number. All his promises were mere words. Most likely, they had parted for good. Nancy wandered around the room like a lost woman and cleaned it after she was sick. Then she began packing up her things, of which she had accumulated quite a few during the time she had been looking after Robert, even for Wet Bunny, with whom Nancy used to sleep at home. The girl dragged him here in her arms, with a small shopping bag in which the hair just did not fit. The girl went out to meet Ethan. He returned after dark and smiled sadly when he noticed her. "Are you still there?" "I couldn't leave without finding out how it ended," Nancy answered. "Did you take Robert to the hospital?" "It went fine." Ethan ignored her question. He was looking at Nancy's bag. "You know what I'm going to miss? Asking you in this house. I guess I'm too used to having you around all the time. You drove Robert all right?" The girl asked again louder. "Did you?" Ethan nodded, but not to the hospital. He asked to be dropped off at the edge of town. He stayed in a small courtyard on a bench, and you just left him there to fend for himself. Nancy gasped. "Ethan, I don't recognize you." "Did you say something like that before today?" the boy remarked. "But how could you abandon someone who needed help?" "Ethan, you're a doctor. You're supposed to heal people, take care of them. What could I do?" Ethan snarled. Fighting him was his choice, and I don't want to violate my name. I wanted to have someone else's will. Besides, I didn't really feel like driving him all over town. I'd had enough of this story. I'd be dreaming about it at night. Nancy put the bag on the porch and firmly declared, "We'll go and get Robert from wherever you left him." Immediately, Ethan looked at her in surprise. "Wow, what a tone. And if I refuse, then I'll go look for him myself on foot. If I must helplessly," Nancy replied. "Or I'll go to the track and stop the car so they can find you later with your head bashed in," Ethan remarked. "Get in already, let's go." Nancy rushed to the car, hurrying before he changed his mind. Ethan got behind the wheel and squinted, looked at the hair. "You know, sometimes I think you like this man precisely because he's all sick and miserable, like this toy from Pity to Love. One step, right? Don't talk nonsense," muttered Nancy. "Let's go faster already. Maybe we can still catch Robert." "I don't think he'll wait for us for an hour." "But we'll try," the guy replied. Nancy feared that Robert might not be there. He wondered what dangers might lie in wait for him on the night streets more than in the night woods. Probably, at least in the thicket of the forest. Nancy had never once encountered criminals or bandits, and Robert had managed to meet both a murderer and a wife who wanted him dead. A complete package to her relief. He was discovered on the very bench where he had left it. Ethan was lying on his back, looking up into the night sky. Nancy immediately rushed to him. "What is it, Robert? You're not well." And that question again, the man smiled. "Now that you're around, I can certainly say that I feel good." Ethan walked over to them and stared at his patient in displeasure. "What are you trying to achieve? May I ask?" He asked. "Do you want to get pneumonia in addition to a concussion? Just so you know, the nights are cold. I was just wondering what I should do next." "Where to go?" Robert answered. "And I think I've figured it out." "Where to?" Nancy asked excitedly to my friend Daniel. If I can't go to my own house, I'll try to wait out the storm at his place. At the very least, I'll find out what's going on around here, what people are saying about my disappearance and all. Nancy glanced at the paramedic. Will you answer him? Ethan, of course I will. I'm a part-time cab driver at night. Had you forgotten? Nancy paid no attention to his sarcasm and pulled Robert toward the car. Dictating the address, she said, casting a warning look at the paramedic. Daniel lived right in the middle of nowhere, in one of the high rises that overlooked the whole city. It was as if he wanted to rise above everyone else, both literally and figuratively, to avenge life for past failures. Cool place, Ethan remarked, surveying the street they were driving down. Nancy, do you think we'll be able to save up for a storage room in these parts by the time we're 70? Or can we not even hope? The girl let his words pass her lips. Something was troubling her, but what was it? Nancy could not tell even to herself. How long have you known your friend? She asked Robert. Since he was a student, but he didn't go to medical school. He went to economics. But we met at the student forum, and then we complimented each other in business. And how do you think he's a good person? Did Nancy keep up? A strange question, Ethan muttered. They are friends, after all. Robert frowned in surprise. You know, I can't say that Daniel is bad, but lately he's been kind of lax. He has become worse at his job. He doesn't care about business. He is somewhere in the clouds, and we haven't had a heart-to-heart talk in a long time. I've never had the time to pay for everything in life, Ethan said in an admonishing tone. You've achieved a lot in life, but you've lost your friends. Robert sighed heavily. Maybe you're right. When I didn't have a business, it was easier, wasn't it? Now it's really hard to tell which are my friends and which are my enemies. It's too confusing. They walked up to the driveway. Ethan hesitantly suggested that we should say goodbye. I will go with Robert, Nancy said. The man looked at her in surprise. What was that for? I don't understand, Ethan. Are you going to look after him forever? Wake up. Nancy, Robert's already at his place. He'll be fine. And I want to see what's mine, said the girl stubbornly. Then I'm with you too, muttered Ethan. Although, to be honest, it's just ridiculous. Nancy, I don't understand you at all. The girl herself wanted to understand what seemed suspicious to her. After what Robert had said about his wife, Nancy was ready to be wary of everyone he knew. Besides, the man in the woods who had attempted to kill Robert was not a woman at all. Robert pressed the intercom button and waited. His friend answered almost immediately. Who is it? Daniel, it's me. Robert, I'm sorry for calling so late. His friend was silent for so long that all three of them thought the intercom was broken. Yes, of course, now he muttered. Strange, Ethan said as they entered the entryway. They went up to the 7th floor in a deadly silence, and when the elevator doors opened, Daniel was already waiting for them on the doorstep. At the sight of his friend, his face turned terribly pale. Robert, is it really you? He muttered. Daniel did not seem particularly happy about his friend's visit. Of course, I answered Robert. Why shouldn't I come and visit you? Didn't we do that in the old days? No, they just said you were missing, Daniel answered. Christina called me. Nancy nudged Ethan with her elbow and whispered with horror that he was the one. Who doesn't get it? The guide is the man from the woods who wanted to kill Robert. They entered the apartment and closed the door behind them. Ethan got all huffy and clutched his suitcase, which he had habitually taken into the apartment, to his chest. Robert, on the other hand, did not suspect a thing. Christina called, did she? He asked. And what did she say? She told me how she came after me with a brick in her hand. I didn't expect that from her. And I didn't expect it from anyone else, either really. Daniel remained silent. Nancy couldn't take it anymore and called out to Robert. It's him. He brought you into the woods. He's your friend. I'm sure of it. Robert looked at her in amazement, and Daniel's voice suddenly broke through. What on earth are you talking about? He barked. What forest? Were you there to see everything? Ethan caught him off his guard. So there was something to see? He asked. Well, that much is clear, Robert. I think we ought to call the police. Or should we interrogate the guy ourselves first? Robert looked at Daniel. Was it really you from the peasantry? He was the lover whose name I couldn't figure out. Daniel looked as if he had a lot of water in his mouth. Ethan slowly reached behind the glass of his briefcase. That's what we're about to find out, he said. I have a remedy here. In small doses, it works like alcohol or a drug. It loosens the tongue of the man himself. What if the police overdose a little too much? Say that's how he was found. Overdoses happen all the time. He pulled a syringe out of his briefcase, some kind of ampoule, and Daniel shook his head fearfully. Robert, you won't, will you? That's a felony. You'd never forgive yourself for that. Have you ever forgiven yourself for the way you attacked me? Robert asked, and nodded at the paramedic. Do it. Ethan did as he saw fit. Daniel ended up telling them all about Christina's plan and how he had participated in it. Later, he repeated it all to the police. Daniel and Christina were taken into custody and are now facing a significant prison sentence. And Ethan and Nancy returned to the village and tried to live as before. But it didn't work out for them. I'm sorry, but I don't think I love you, the girl said, once pulling away from the guy when he wanted to kiss her. Ethan, you're nice really, but to me you're just a friend. The man grinned incredulously. I've already figured out the beat-up one. Better right. It's not about him. Nancy shook her head. It's just that I've learned a lot during this time. You and I are very different. I like the woods, you like the city. I'm too ordinary for you. You need someone as colorful as you, Ethan asked. Alina answered with a smile. Can't you see it in her? She has had a crush on you ever since that day. How did you show up here? Eliona, mumbled the boy. Do you girls like to arrange each other's family life? Okay, I'm not going to think about that just yet. I've got work to do. You'd better watch out for her, though. Nancy yelled after him. She's great. You two are going to make a great couple, and I'm sure of it. Ethan waved at her. He didn't seem to be mad at Nancy. He'd probably been expecting something like this ever since the girl had told him about the injured stranger in the woods. Nancy went home, pondering how strange life was. Everyone had predicted Ethan as her husband, and she was the only one who felt from the beginning that she and he were not a couple. Then who was her soulmate? Where to find her? Whatever Ethan thought. But many days passed, and there was no word from Robert. The girl was so preoccupied that she almost crashed into a huge SUV parked outside her house. Robert got out of the car with a smile and handed her a bouquet of lilies. Good afternoon. And this is for you, Nancy. A little belated gift for my rescue. I promised to let you know how I was doing. Didn't I get your number? I came in person. I hope you're not offended that I allowed myself such impudence. I resent the fact that I waited so long for you, answered Nancy, and rushed to his neck, all forgotten. And the bouquet fell to the ground. Not the flowers, not the confessions. There was no point anymore. Robert and Nancy were finally together and would never part now.